Okay, y'all. You are not going to believe the utterly insane, heartbreaking, soul-crushing story I'm about to unpack for you. This is how I found out the man I married, the man I built a life with, the man I thought I knew inside and out, was a complete, total, fabricated fraud. Like, from the ground up. Every single major thing he told me about himself, a lie. You're going to sit here and think, how? How could anyone fall for this? How could anyone do this? And honestly, I still ask myself those questions every single day. This isn't just a story. This was my life. And it was built on a mountain of lies so high, so elaborate, it makes your head spin just thinking about it. It all started, really, with a simple swipe right, an innocent coffee date, and a man who seemed absolutely perfect. If you're ready for the whole unfiltered truth, and trust me, it's a lot, hit that like, subscribe right now, and honestly, share this with anyone who needs to hear it. Grab a drink, maybe a whole bottle, and settle in because this is gonna be a long, wild ride. All right, deep breath. Here's where it all began. It was late spring, about 6 years ago now. I was living in Dallas, Texas, working a job I liked well enough, happy with my friends, just living. Not really looking for anything serious, you know? Had my heart broken a few times, learned my lessons, was just enjoying being single. A friend of mine convinced me to try this new dating app, not one of the big ones, kind of niche, focused on people with similar professional backgrounds, which felt less chaotic. I matched with a guy named David Sterling. His profile was great, professional, but warm. He looked kind in his pictures, kind eyes, genuine smile. He listed his profession as a senior financial analyst at this fancy-sounding firm called Pinnacle Capital, based out of Denver, but said he'd recently relocated to Dallas for a new project, a temporary assignment that might turn permanent. He was 35, never married, no kids, same as me at the time. His bio mentioned he loved hiking, reading, and finding the best local coffee shops. Normal stuff, right? Nothing screamed, run for the hills. We started messaging, and the connection was instant. Easy conversation, good banter, similar sense of humor. We talked about books, travel, work frustrations. It felt effortless, like finding a missing piece you didn't know was lost. Within a couple of days, he asked for my number, and we were texting constantly. Good morning texts, funny memes throughout the day, long calls in the evening. He sounded smart, successful, and genuinely interested in me. He asked questions. He remembered details I told him. It felt different, special. Our first date was coffee at a local cafe downtown. He was even better in person. Taller than I expected, well-dressed, but not overly formal. He had this calm, confident energy about him. We talked for hours. Hours. About everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in a small, picturesque town called Willow Creek, just outside of Denver. He painted this idyllic picture. Mountain views, close-knit community, a family that owned a local hardware store, wholesome stuff. Said he was the oldest of 3. His younger sister was a teacher. His brother was a park ranger. His parents were retired now, living out their days, enjoying the mountain air. He talked about his career path, how he'd always been good with numbers, loved the strategy of finance, worked hard to get where he was. He seemed so grounded, so real. He asked about my family, my job, my dreams. He listened intently, nodding, making thoughtful comments. It felt like he saw me. Not just a date, but a person he genuinely wanted to connect with. By the end of the date, when he walked me to my car, I felt this fluttery, hopeful feeling I hadn't felt in years. He kissed me goodnight, soft, sweet, respectful. He texted me the minute I got home to make sure I made it safely and to say he had an amazing time and couldn't wait to see me again. And just like that, I was hooked. The dates came quickly after that. Dinner, museums, walks in the park, trying, new restaurants. We were inseparable. Everything felt perfect. He was attentive, charming, supportive. He seemed genuinely happy just being around me. We'd have these long talks about the future, not in a pressury way, but just dreaming. Out loud. He'd talk about wanting a family someday, maybe moving back closer to the mountains, finding a place with a yard for dogs. He talked about his plans at Pinnacle Capital, how this Dallas project was a big step up for him, potentially leading to a permanent senior role here. He seemed ambitious, driven, successful. All the things you look for, right? He was also incredibly private about certain things, which, looking back, should have been a screaming red flag the size of Texas. But at the time, I rationalized it. He was new to town, focused on his high-stakes job, didn't know anyone yet. He didn't have many friends here, or so he said. His family was back in Colorado. Okay, makes sense. My family lived in a different state too. We bonded over that. Being away from our families, building our own lives. It felt like another point of connection. He never talked about his specific day-to-day work beyond general terms. Busy day, client meeting, traveling for work next week. Normal stuff for someone in finance, I thought. He'd occasionally get calls that he'd take privately, stepping out of the room or lowering his voice. He'd say it was confidential client stuff. Again, seemed plausible. High finance, right? Secrets and discretion. I wasn't in that world, so I just accepted it. He was also weirdly vague about specifics of Willow Creek. If I asked about a specific landmark or a street, he'd give a general answer. Like, oh yeah, Main Street was the place to be. Or, the old hardware store? Yeah, that was our family's business for generations. Never specific names of parks, schools he went to, or even the names of friends he grew up with. He'd always deflect with a smile and pivot the conversation back to us, or to something happening now. At the time, I thought he was just a private person, or maybe the small town was just small, and didn't have that many memorable details. I grew up in a suburb. My memories weren't exactly postcard-worthy either, so I didn't push. Red flag number 1, y'all, and I just walked right past it, because everything else felt so perfect. He was perfect. His story was perfect. Our connection was perfect. And when something feels that perfect, you really, really want to believe it's real. Yeah, you want to believe it's real so bad, you start ignoring the little things that don't quite add up. Those tiny inconsistencies I mentioned? They weren't loud alarms yet, more like faint whispers in the back of my mind that I actively shushed. Like, he claimed to be from Willow Creek, Colorado, right? Small mountain town. Picturesque. But he had zero social media presence. None. Not even a dusty LinkedIn profile that showed his career progression. When I casually mentioned this, he laughed it off, saying he was old school, liked his privacy, didn't need to broadcast his life online. He said his job required discretion anyway. And again, I bought it. Made sense, sort of. Pinnacle Capital, high finance. Maybe they discouraged it? Red flag number 2. Who in their mid-30s has zero digital footprint in this day and age, especially working in a field like finance? But he was so charming when he said it, so confident. It just didn't feel suspicious at the time. It felt like part of his mystique. Maybe. He'd talk about his family occasionally, but always in general terms. My sister called today, or my parents are doing well. Never, my sister Sarah is struggling with her 3rd graders this year. Or, Mom and Dad are planning a trip to Yellowstone. He didn't have photos of them on his phone that he readily shared. When I asked to see pictures of Willow Creek or his family, he'd either say his phone was a mess, or he'd quickly show me a generic landscape photo he claimed was near his parents' house, or a blurry group photo he said was a distant family reunion. Nothing clear, nothing that felt personal or candid. Red flag number 3. I showed him Tons of pictures of my family, my hometown, my friends. It felt lopsided. But he'd say things like, "You're so open. I admire that. I'm just a bit more private." And I, naive idiot that I was, interpreted that as him being reserved, maybe a little shy about his past, which made the glimpses he did offer feel more precious. He told me about his brother, the park ranger, being rugged and outdoorsy, and his sister, the teacher, being the sweet, sensible one. He talked about family holidays being a big deal in Willow Creek, but always had an excuse why he couldn't go visit right now. A big project deadline, couldn't get time off, needed to be in Dallas for a crucial meeting. It was always something. Perfectly logical, job-related. Since his job was the reason he was in Dallas in the first place, it reinforced the idea that his career was demanding and required him to be here. His stories about growing up were inconsistent if I really paid attention, but I wasn't scrutinizing yet. Like, he'd mention sledding in deep snow one time, then talk about mild winters another. Or mention a specific high school event that didn't quite line up with the size of town he described. But these were tiny things, easily dismissed as him, misremembering or me mishearing. He was such a smooth talker, so good at weaving a narrative, that any little snag felt like my mistake, not his. He never introduced me to anyone from his past. No childhood friends, no college buddies, and definitely no family. He always had an explanation. His college friends were scattered across the country. His work friends in Denver were just acquaintances, not close pals. His family was obviously back in Colorado. It made sense that my social circle became our social circle. He easily integrated into my life, charming my friends and even my parents when they visited, via video call, of course. They lived too far away for him to meet in person right away. My friends loved him. My parents approved. He was handsome, successful, polite, and seemed to adore me. What was there not to love? We talked about finances early on, as couples do. He told me he was doing very well at Pinnacle Capital. Comfortable. Had investments, saving for a house, the usual markers of someone on solid ground. He was generally responsible with money when we were out. Always paid, never seemed stressed about bills. This contradicted the later financial weirdness that emerged, but at this point, it all seemed fine. He paid for most things, which was generous, but I insisted on contributing, splitting meals sometimes, buying tickets for events. He never pushed back too hard, but he definitely took the lead financially. This, I later learned, was a power play, a way to control the narrative and make me feel secure in his apparent success. About 8 months in, things got more serious. We were spending almost every night together at my place or his small, rented apartment downtown. His apartment was sparsely furnished, kind of sterile, which he blamed on being transient for his job. He didn't have many personal items. A few books, some generic art, no family photos on display, nothing that screamed home or reflected a long history of living anywhere. Again, I rationalized it. Professional on assignment. Minimalist. Maybe. Red flag number 4. A grown man with no personal touches in his living space. It felt off, but I didn't dwell on it. We started talking about the what-ifs. What if his project in Dallas became permanent? What if we wanted to take the next step? It felt like a natural progression. I was head over heels. He seemed head over heels. Every day with him felt like a dream. He said and did all the right things. He was supportive when I had a bad day at work, celebrated my successes like they were his own, cooked for me, listened. He was the partner I had always dreamed of having. So when he brought up the idea of us moving in together, it felt like the most natural, exciting thing in the world. A confirmation that this was real, this was permanent, this was us. I was ready to build a future with him. A future built on the solid foundation of whatever he was presenting himself to be. I just didn't know yet how shaky that foundation actually was. The thought of us living together, merging our lives, felt like a fairy tale. But fairy tales, I was about to learn, can sometimes be the most elaborate lies of all. And moving in? That's when the cracks really started to show, even if I was still trying my best to spackle over them with hope and denial. Moving in together felt like the ultimate step towards forever. We decided it made sense for him to move into my place. It was a comfortable size, I owned it, and his apartment lease was ending. He said it was perfect, less hassle for him, especially with his demanding work schedule. We spent a weekend packing his stuff, which was surprisingly little, mostly clothes and some electronics. I remember feeling slightly disappointed that there wasn't more him to integrate into my home. No boxes of old photos, no beloved childhood relics, just stuff, practical things. But again, I told myself it was because he traveled light, always ready for the next assignment. Professional efficiency. Red flag number 5. Screaming a little louder this time. Living together changed things, of course. You see a person's habits, their routines, the little quirks you don't see during dates. For the most part, it was great. He was tidy, helped. With chores, we settled into a comfortable rhythm. But the secrecy didn't go away. It just became more noticeable. His phone was always on silent, always face down. He'd take calls in another room, his voice hushed. If I walked in, he'd quickly end the call or change the subject. He said it was client confidentiality, but it felt shifty. It felt like he was hiding something from me. His work hours were erratic. Sometimes he'd work late into the night, supposedly on calls with Denver or clients in other time zones. Other times he'd have inexplicable days off, where he'd just be home, vague about his schedule. He still traveled sometimes, for client meetings, usually for a day or two, sometimes a week. He'd be cagey about where he was going. Just New York for a meeting, or client site visit out west. Never specific cities or company names. When he was gone, he wouldn't call as much as he did when we were dating, just brief texts. He'd blame it on being busy with work, long days. I missed him, but I understood. Or I tried to understand. The financial oddities started becoming harder to ignore. He was supposedly a senior financial analyst at a prestigious firm, making good money, but he never seemed to have liquid cash readily available. He'd pay for things with credit cards constantly, even small purchases. If I needed him to pick something up and gave him cash, he'd sometimes forget to pay me back. Not in a malicious way, but just forgetful. Or he'd offer to send me money for something, but it would take days to show up, with an excuse about bank transfers or system delays. He was always waiting for a big payment to clear, or explaining a temporary cash flow issue because of an investment deal. Red flag number 6, flashing intermittently now. Someone who manages finances for a living seemed surprisingly disorganized with his own. I started noticing things like mail addressed to him from different P.O. boxes, not just our address. When I asked, he said they were related to old accounts or investments. Okay, plausible. He got a lot of packages, sometimes discreetly delivered. He'd open them quickly and stash the contents away. If I asked what it was always something mundane, office supplies, books for work, a gift for my birthday he didn't want me to see yet. One time, early one morning, I woke up and he was on a call in the living room. He was talking in a hushed, urgent tone. I couldn't hear everything, but I distinctly heard him say something about the address and keeping a low profile. When he saw I was awake, he hung up immediately and startled, spilling his coffee slightly. He looked rattled. He quickly composed himself and said it was a sensitive work call, dealing with a client situation that required privacy. He apologized for waking me. My gut twisted. Keeping a low profile? What did that even mean? Why would a financial analyst need to keep a low profile? I asked him about it later, trying to be casual. He gave a vague answer about a client undergoing a difficult audit and needing to avoid attention. It didn't make complete sense, but his explanation was just coherent enough, and his demeanor just convincing enough to push my unease back down. Red flag number 7. And this one felt cold and sharp. He still never introduced me to his family, even though we were living together now. It had been over a year since we met. He had reasons, of course. His sister was pregnant and having a difficult time. Didn't need visitors. His parents were traveling. His brother was on a long-term park service assignment out of state. Always something. He promised we'd go visit Willow Creek soon, maybe for a holiday, but the plans never materialized. I started feeling a pang of sadness, wanting to share this big part of my life, the man I loved, with my own family, and realizing he wasn't doing the same. It felt like his life, the one back in Colorado, was kept separate, behind a curtain. I wasn't allowed to peek behind. Despite these growing whispers of doubt, the relationship deepened. We talked about getting married. It felt like the natural next step for a couple living together, building a life. He seemed enthusiastic, loving, committed. He talked about our future house, about starting a family. The vision he painted was so compelling, so full of shared dreams, that it was powerful enough to overshadow the inconsistencies, the secrecy, the vague explanations. I wanted that future with him so desperately. I was already so invested, emotionally and now practically. I loved him, or I loved the man I thought he was, the charming, successful, family-oriented man from Willow Creek, the man who seemed to fit so perfectly into my life. The little voices of doubt were there, quieter some days, louder on others, but they weren't screaming liar yet. They were just whispering something's off. And I kept telling myself everyone has their quirks, their private sides, their pasts that aren't laid bare. I was making excuses, big, fat, hopeful excuses. Because the alternative, that the man I was planning to marry wasn't who he said he was simply unthinkable. The idea of him being a fraud, someone who could look me in the eye every day and lie about fundamental parts of his existence, felt like science fiction. It couldn't be real. Not my David, not the man who held my hand, kissed me goodnight, and talked about our future kids' names. It just couldn't. And that refusal to even entertain the possibility kept me blind for far, far too long. It kept me smiling and planning, utterly unaware of the earthquake building beneath my feet. So like I was saying, everything felt so perfect on the surface. He was charming, attentive, seemed to have his life together, the successful job, the stable background he described, the desire for a future. But underneath that polished veneer, there were these tiny, almost imperceptible cracks starting to form. The first tiny red flags. They weren't enough to make me slam on the brakes, not even close. But looking back now, with the terrifying clarity that only hindsight brings, they were absolutely signals, warnings, and I just missed them, or chose to ignore them. One of the earliest ones, besides the zero social media presence and the vague family details, was about his past relationships. We talked about our exes, briefly, as you do. I was pretty open about mine, learning experiences, etc. He, on the other hand, was incredibly guarded. He'd just say things like, "Oh, nothing serious, just a few relationships that didn't work out," or "dated around a bit, but nothing felt right until you." He never mentioned names, never gave details about what happened, why they ended, what he learned. It was like that part of his life was a blank slate. At the time, I thought, okay, maybe he's just private, or, great, he's not bringing baggage into this. But a complete lack of detail? No war stories, no funny anecdotes about a past girlfriend's dog, nothing relatable from years of dating. In his 30s? It was just empty. Red flag number 4. It felt like he hadn't had a past relationship to talk about, not in the way most people do. Then there were the stories about Willow Creek. Like I said, he painted this picture of a small idyllic mountain town, but if I asked a follow-up question based on something he'd previously mentioned, the details would sometimes shift slightly. He'd talk about the main street being the heart of town, but then describe a movie theater or a specific type of restaurant that didn't sound like it belonged in the tiny, quaint place he'd initially depicted. Or he'd mention a specific high school rival or a local hangout, but then later deny knowing anyone by that name or place. It was subtle, like a word choice here or there, a slight contradiction. I'd notice it and think, that's weird. But then he'd move on, charm offensive back on, and I'd forget the inconsistency. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. The details kept slipping away if you tried to grasp them too firmly. Red flag number 5. The narrative wasn't solid. It was fluid, shifting just enough to evade close inspection. He also had this strange habit of receiving packages at different addresses. Not just the P.O. boxes that came later, but sometimes he'd have things shipped to his office, Pinnacle Capital, remember? Or even a random mailboxes, etc. type place he claimed was for work-related deliveries he needed to keep separate. He said it was logistical, easier for high-value items or confidential documents. It seemed plausible, given his supposed job, but it added to the feeling that parts of his life were siloed, kept separate from mine and from each other. Red flag number 6. Why so many different points of contact? Why not just his apartment, or later, our home? His phone habits were also odd, even in those early dating days. Always on silent, always face down. He never left it unattended when he went to the bathroom or stepped out of the room. If a notification popped up and I was nearby, he'd quickly swipe it away or pick up the phone and immediately start scrolling, his body language closed off. He said it was work, sensitive info, company policy. And honestly, working in finance, I could see how discretion might be important. But it felt excessive. It felt like guarding a secret, not just protecting data. Red flag number 7. The phone was an extension of his secrecy, a barrier between his private world and me. He never wanted to video call his family when he talked to them. He'd call, sure, but it was always just voice calls. When I suggested a group video call so I could finally meet them, he'd make an excuse. His parents weren't tech-savvy. His sister preferred privacy. His brother was in a remote area with bad signal. Always a perfectly reasonable explanation, but cumulatively, they added up to a complete lack of visual proof of the people he claimed were so important to him. Red flag number 8. It started feeling like a pattern of avoidance when it came to anything requiring tangible evidence of his claimed life. These weren't massive, earth-shattering issues initially. They were just off notes in an otherwise beautiful symphony. A slight dissonance that you could almost convince yourself was intentional, part of the composition. Maybe he was just a very private person. Maybe his job was that demanding and secretive. Maybe his family was just camera shy and lived off the grid in picturesque Willow Creek. I wanted to believe his explanations because the alternative was too painful to consider. The alternative meant the amazing connection, the shared dreams. The future we were building was based on something shaky. And I was already falling, hard and fast. When you're on that emotional high, your critical thinking skills take a back seat. You prioritize the good feelings, the hope, the potential, and you sideline the nagging doubts. You tell yourself you're being silly, paranoid. He's perfect, remember? This must just be his quirks. Everyone has quirks, right? It's easy to look back now and think, how could you not see it? But at the time, these red flags were like those nearly invisible threads on a spider web. You might catch a glint of them in the right light, but mostly, you just walk right through them, oblivious, until you're completely entangled. And with David, I was becoming more and more entangled every single day. His charm, his attentiveness, the way he made me feel seen and loved. It was powerful glue. It stuck me firmly to the narrative he was creating, making it harder and harder to pull away and examine the loose threads. These were the faint whispers, the gentle nudges from my intuition that I chose to interpret as background noise. They were the first signs that the picture he was painting wasn't quite right. But I was so focused on the beautiful parts of the canvas, I refused to look too closely at the edges. And yeah, rationalizing. That was the name of the game for the first, well, honestly, for most of the relationship. Every time one of those little red flags would flutter up, the vague answers about his past, the phone secrecy, the elusive family, the slightly inconsistent stories, my brain would immediately kick into overdrive, finding a reason, an excuse, a perfectly logical explanation for it. It wasn't just him providing the excuses. I was providing them to myself, often before he even had to. It was a desperate attempt to protect the beautiful bubble we were living in, because the thought of that bubble bursting was terrifying. He was a pro at deflection, and providing just enough of an answer to satisfy a casual question without giving away any real information. If I asked about a specific place in Willow Creek he'd mentioned, he'd say something like, "Oh, that old diner? It's probably not even there anymore. Small towns change so fast." Or, "Yeah, loved spending time there, but it was more of a local, secret spot, hard to describe to outsiders." It was always vague, always dismissive of needing more detail, and often ended with a charming smile or a change of subject to us. And I'd accept it. Why? Because it was easier than pushing. Pushing meant potentially hitting a wall, and I didn't want to find a wall. Rationalization number 1. He's just protective of his past. Maybe he had a difficult time growing up despite the idyllic description. Maybe it's painful to talk about. Be understanding. The no social media thing? His explanation was privacy. Job requirement, old school. Rationalization number 2. Okay, it's unusual, but some people are just like that. Not everyone lives online. And honestly, it was kind of refreshing in a way. Felt more real. Like he was truly present when we were together, not distracted by posting about it. See? Turning a red flag into a positive. Classic. His family being perpetually unavailable or off-grid. Rationalization number 3. Families are complicated. My family isn't local either. It's not weird that it takes time to integrate. Maybe his family really are private or busy, or there's some internal family dynamic I don't understand. He talks about them fondly. He must have a family. Who would lie about something like having parents or siblings? It seemed too fundamental to be fake. Plus, he never asked for money from his family or talked about drama with them, which in my limited experience often came with meeting a partner's family. The lack of drama felt like a good sign. Oh, the layers of self-deception. The secretive phone calls and the face-down phone. Rationalization number 4. His job is high finance. Insider trading, confidential deals, sensitive client information. I literally knew nothing about that world except what I saw in movies. And in movies, finance people are always secretive and on calls. It made sense within the narrative he'd built about his career. And he always reassured me it was just work, nothing personal. And I wanted to believe him. Believing him meant he wasn't hiding anything from me, only from the rest of the world because his job required it. The inconsistent stories about Willow Creek. Rationalization number 5. Memory is a funny thing. Maybe he's misremembering details from years ago. Maybe I'm misremembering what he said. It's just a small town. Maybe the details aren't that distinct. Maybe he's embellishing slightly. Everyone does that when they talk about their hometown, right? A little bit of rose-tinted glasses. Nothing malicious, just nostalgic fuzziness. Every single red flag, no matter how small or how frequent, was met with an internal chorus of rationalizations, backed up by his smooth, confident explanations. And because he seemed so genuinely invested in us, because he did so many other things right, he was kind to me, supportive, made me laugh, physically affectionate. The weight of the positive felt heavier than the cumulative weight of the negative. It's like standing on a scale with 100 tiny pebbles of doubt on one side and a big, heavy boulder of, "He loves me, this is real," on the other. You just ignore the pebbles. My gut instinct, that little voice that whispered, "Something's off," was constantly being shouted down by my brain, which was screaming, "Don't mess this up. This is what you wanted. Don't be paranoid. He's perfect." I was so afraid of being wrong about him, so afraid of ruining a good thing by being suspicious, that I actively suppressed my own intuition. I told myself I was being insecure, that I needed to trust my partner. Trust was crucial in a relationship, wasn't it? And he seemed to trust me implicitly. So I had to reciprocate that trust, even when things didn't add up. It wasn't just about believing him. It was about believing in the story we were building, in the future we were planning. Every time I rationalized a doubt, I wasn't just excusing his behavior. I was investing further in the fantasy. I was reinforcing to myself that this was real, that he was who he said he was, that I wasn't making a terrible mistake. It felt like a necessary process to allow the relationship to grow. You can't build a future with someone you constantly suspect, right? So I had to squash the suspicion. I had to choose to believe the narrative he presented, the charming, successful, grounded man from the mountains, and discard anything that contradicted it as irrelevant noise. It was self-preservation of the relationship, even if it meant sacrificing my own peace of mind and, eventually, facing a much harsher reality. That constant internal battle, gut feeling versus rationalization, was exhausting. But love, or what I thought was love, made me choose the rationalizations every single time. Despite those quiet whispers of doubt and the active work I was doing to rationalize them away, the relationship was absolutely deepening. We were falling more and more in love, or so I believed. The period between those first subtle red flags and the decision to move in was about solidifying us. We weren't just dating anymore. We were a unit. We spent holidays together. Or rather, we spent holidays together with my family, either in person or via video calls. He seamlessly fit in, charming everyone. My parents adored him. My sister thought he was the sweetest. My friends loved having him around. He was funny, engaging, polite, and genuinely seemed to enjoy spending time with them. He asked them questions, remembered details about their lives. He was the perfect partner at social gatherings, which only reinforced the idea that he was the perfect partner, period. He became my go-to person for everything. Good news, bad news, work stress, everyday annoyances. I leaned on him, and he seemed happy to be there for me. He'd listen patiently, offer advice, or just hold me. He was physically affectionate, lots of hand-holding, spontaneous hugs, kissing, my forehead, small gestures that make you feel loved and secure. We had inside jokes, routines, comfort. It felt like we were building a genuine connection, a deep bond forged in shared experiences and mutual support. We took short trips together, weekend getaways to Austin or New Orleans, maybe a week-long vacation to Mexico. On these trips, he was relaxed and fun. He'd manage all the logistics, which was great, but also, again, a way for him to maintain control over details like bookings or payment methods. He'd take calls, of course, always the sensitive work, calls, but he seemed present and happy to be with me otherwise. These trips felt like previews of our future life together, comfortable and easy. We talked about getting married, about having kids, about where we'd want to live eventually. He'd describe our future home, maybe a place with a little bit of land outside the city, room for dogs. He talked about raising kids, his face softening as he imagined teaching them things, taking them hiking like his own dad supposedly did. These conversations felt incredibly real and heartfelt. He wasn't just saying the words, He seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of building this future. With me. And those visions, that shared excitement about a tangible future, were incredibly powerful. They acted like blinders, making it harder to focus on the things that didn't quite line up in his present or past. He also started subtly integrating himself more into my daily life, and even my finances, though I didn't see it that way at the time. He'd help me look at my budget, offering unsolicited advice on investments or saving, given his supposed expertise. He'd sometimes offer to handle paying a bill or transferring money online for me if I was busy, saying things like, "Just let me take care of that. Save you the hassle." It felt helpful, him wanting to take care of me, but it also gave him glimpses into my financial picture and normalized him handling my sensitive information. Red flag number 9, disguised as helpfulness. The decision to move in felt like a natural, inevitable step. We were already spending most nights together, leaving toothbrushes and clothes at each other's places. It just made sense logistically, emotionally, financially. He brought it up first, maybe about 8 months into the relationship. He framed it as wanting to take our relationship to the next level, wanting to share a home with me, build a life together under one roof. It felt incredibly romantic and validating. He didn't pressure me, but he made it clear it was what he wanted, and I wanted it too. I was completely head over heels, utterly convinced he was the one. We talked about whose place made the most sense. My place was better, owned, slightly larger, in a neighborhood I loved. His was a small rented apartment downtown that, as I mentioned before, felt sterile and temporary. He readily agreed my place made more sense. He'd talk about it as our place almost immediately, planning little changes, suggesting furniture rearrangements. It felt like a joint venture, the merging of our lives. There was excitement, pure excitement, about this next chapter. But even amidst the planning and the anticipation, those familiar whispers of doubt would surface occasionally. Like packing. Up his apartment was weirdly fast, remember? So few personal belongings. It felt like he was packing up a temporary rental, not a home he'd lived in for months. And the ongoing issue of never meeting his family still gnawed at me a bit, especially as we were talking about moving in together. This was a huge step. Shouldn't families be involved? But again, the rationalizations. They're busy, they're private, we'll meet them soon. The promise of meeting them soon was always dangled, just out of reach, enough to keep the hope alive and the questions at bay. We set a date for the move. I was thrilled, nervous, optimistic. This was it. This was building our future, laying down the foundations for marriage, family, everything we talked about. I was so caught up in the vision of us living together, waking up next to each other every morning, sharing a home, that I completely pushed down the unease about the parts of his life that remained hidden. Moving in felt like a declaration of permanence, proof that his temporary assignment in Dallas was becoming permanent, proof that we were permanent. It felt like stepping across a threshold into our shared life. I didn't realize I was actually stepping further into the elaborate stage setting of his life, a stage where the props were real but the backdrop was completely fake. The decision to move in felt like the culmination of a beautiful courtship. But in hindsight, it was the moment I truly locked myself into the intricate, dangerous web he was weaving. And the real unraveling was about to begin, layer by hidden layer, right inside my own home. Living together didn't magically make the secrecy disappear, unfortunately. It just shone a brighter, harsher light on it. And one of the biggest, most persistent shadows in his life was his family. Remember how I mentioned he never introduced me to them? Even after we moved in together, after we were talking about marriage and forever, I still hadn't met a single member of the Sterling family. It had been over a year at this point, maybe closer to 18 months since we'd met. We were sharing a home, sharing a bed, sharing our daily lives. But his family remained completely invisible. He still talked about them sometimes, casually. My sister called today. My dad was asking about the weather here. But never anything specific I could latch onto. Never an invitation to talk to them myself. I'd bring it up gently at first. Hey, maybe we could plan a trip to Willow Creek soon. It would be so great to finally meet your parents. And he'd agree enthusiastically. Oh, absolutely, honey. We have to do that. They're dying to meet you. But then came the inevitable excuses. His sister was having issues with her pregnancy. This excuse lasted for months, well past 9 months, come to think of it. His parents were suddenly planning a long trip. First it was Europe, then it was cross-country RVing. His brother, the park ranger, was always on some remote assignment with no signal. It was always something, perfectly plausible on its own, but stacking up into an undeniable pattern of avoidance. The excuses got more elaborate over time. The RV trip got extended. The sister's issues morphed into needing help after the baby was born, so she couldn't have visitors disrupting things. His brother's park ranger job seemed to take him to literally every corner of the country except where we were. It felt like every time I suggested a specific date or holiday, a new, insurmountable obstacle would suddenly pop up in Willow Creek. It started to hurt. It felt like he was keeping a massive part of his life separate from me. I had brought him completely into my world. He knew my family, my friends, my history. My parents, bless them, were so understanding. They knew his family wasn't local, but they'd still ask about them, politely. Any word on when we might get to meet David's parents? They'd ask me on our weekly calls, and I'd have to make up some version of his latest excuse. It felt like I was starting to lie to my own family to cover for him. That was a heavy feeling. Red flag number 10, a deep, aching one. Why was it so impossible to meet the people who supposedly raised him, who supposedly owned that quaint hardware store for generations? I tried talking to him about it more directly, not accusatory, but from a place of vulnerability. David, I'd say, it really means a lot to me to meet your family. It feels like a big step, and it's hard that they're not really a part of our lives yet, especially as serious as we are. He'd get quiet, look genuinely apologetic, and then launch into another variation of the standard excuses, often adding how much he wanted me to meet them, how sure he was I'd love them, how it was just bad timing right now. He'd say things like, "You know I want you to meet them more than anything, right? It's just complicated with their health travel sisters situation right now." He'd make me feel guilty for even bringing it up, like I wasn't being understanding of his family's delicate circumstances. It was a subtle form of manipulation, turning my valid desire for connection into a perceived lack of empathy on my part. I remember one specific conversation. I was feeling particularly down about it after talking to my mom. I asked him, point blank, "Do your parents know about me? Like, really know? Do they know we live together? That we're serious?" And he looked hurt, almost offended. "Of course they do," he insisted. "I tell them everything about you. They see pictures of us. They adore you already." But what pictures? He never shared them with me. He never video called them when I was around. It was just his word. And his word was starting to feel like it was the only proof I had of his entire history. I started doing little things. Harmless things, I thought. I tried searching online for Sterling Hardware, Willow Creek, Colorado. Found a few results, but none seemed to match the time frame or description he gave. The town of Willow Creek did exist, small and mountainous, just like he said. But finding concrete ties between his story and the reality of the town was impossible with the limited information he gave me. Searching for David Sterling at Pinnacle Capital in Denver or Dallas yielded nothing concrete either, just generic company pages. No employee profiles that matched him. He'd always had an answer for this too. His role was too sensitive for public profiles, or he used a different version of his name for work, or the company was very private. More rationalizations I desperately clung to. The invisible family wasn't just about meeting parents. It was about a fundamental part of his identity that was kept hidden. It made me question everything about his background story. Was his sister really a teacher? Was his brother really a park ranger? Did his parents really own that hardware store? These were core biographical details, things most people's lives are built upon. And yet for David, they were completely inaccessible, tucked away behind a wall of excuses and vague descriptions. Looking back, this should have been the loudest alarm bell yet. A grown man, in a serious relationship, living with his partner, unable or unwilling to introduce her to his family after a year and a half? It's not just private, it's suspicious. It suggests either the family isn't who he says they are, or they don't exist, or he isn't who he says he is, and can't let those two worlds collide. But I was so deep in, so emotionally invested, so in love with the man he presented himself to be, that I kept finding ways to make it okay. I told myself it was a temporary situation, that soon all these obstacles would clear, and I'd finally meet the wonderful Sterling family from Willow Creek, and all my doubts would vanish. I was holding on to that hope like a life raft, refusing to acknowledge that the ship was already taking on water, and the life raft was made of pure fantasy. And the deeper I got into rationalizing the family issue, the more I was willing to rationalize other things that started going seriously wrong. Things like the money. While I was busy trying to understand the mystery of the invisible family, another, equally disturbing pattern was emerging. Weirdness with money. David was supposedly this hotshot senior financial analyst dealing with big numbers and high stakes, investments at Pinnacle Capital. His narrative painted him as financially successful, stable, someone who knew how to manage money. But his actual behavior with money was the opposite. It started subtly when we were dating. Little things like always paying with a credit card, even for small items. But living together, you see everything. I noticed he received a lot of bills and statements, often from different banks or credit card companies I hadn't heard of. He'd open them quickly, his brow furrowed, and then stash them away. If I asked about it, it was always work stuff, or investments, or just sorting out some old accounts. He never left them lying around. Then there were the cash flow issues, which became more frequent and harder to ignore. He'd be waiting for a big transfer to come through, or a deal to close, which meant he was temporarily short on funds. He'd ask me to cover expenses, big and small. Buying groceries, paying for dinner, putting gas in the car, covering our share of a utility bill. It wasn't a constant ask, but it happened often enough that it felt off. This was the senior financial analyst who was doing very well at his prestigious firm, remember? He'd always promised to pay me back the minute his transfer cleared or his deal closed, and sometimes he would, days or even weeks later. But often, he'd just forget, or the amount would roll into some larger running tally that he vaguely kept track of. I didn't want to nickel and dime the man I loved and lived with, so I'd let it slide. It felt petty to chase him for $50 for groceries when we were talking about spending our lives together. Red flag number 11, disguised as marital, sharing, but actually a slow drain. His credit card use was baffling if you believed his income level. He maxed them out regularly. I'd see statements with huge balances, high interest rates. When I gently asked about it, he'd say it was strategic, using company cards for travel expenses that would be reimbursed, never saw the reimbursements, or leveraging credit for investments, never saw the investments. He had an explanation for everything, delivered with that same calm confidence that made me feel like I was the one who didn't understand how high finance worked. He was the expert, after all. He also became very interested in my finances. He'd review my bank statements, my investment accounts, my budget. He'd frame it as helping me manage my money better, offering his professional expertise. "As a financial analyst, I can help you optimize this," he'd say. It felt supportive, him wanting to help me be financially savvy. But in hindsight, he was gathering information. He knew exactly how much money I had, where it was, and how accessible it was. Red flag number 12, dressed up as helpful partnership. He started suggesting we pool our money more directly. Not joint accounts yet, thankfully, but things like him suggesting I transfer money to his account for a joint purchase he was making, because it was easier, or he got a better rate on his card. Or him managing a specific bill payment from my account because he was doing the online banking anyway. It was small steps, normalizing the idea of our finances being intertwined, with him as the de facto manager. The stories about Pinnacle Capital and his big deals started sounding more and more like fantasies the more I saw his actual financial situation. How could someone making the kind of money he claimed be constantly waiting for transfers, racking up credit card debt, and needing his girlfriend to cover utility bills? It didn't compute. But again, the rationalizations flooded in. Maybe his job was commission-based? Maybe he had massive student loans from a fancy MBA? Maybe he was secretly supporting his family back in Willow Creek? I invented reasons for his financial instability because the alternative, that his entire professional persona was a lie, was too terrifying to contemplate. He'd have intense, hushed phone calls that seemed to be about money. I'd overhear snippets, client funds, transfer didn't clear, need to cover that by Tuesday. He'd always clam up or leave the room if I was nearby. He'd look stressed, sometimes visibly sweating during these calls. But afterwards, he'd compose himself and offer a vague explanation about a client having issues or a complex transaction. One particularly bad episode happened about a year and a half into living together. We had a joint expense coming up, maybe a larger household repair or a planned vacation payment. We'd agreed to split it. The deadline was approaching, and I asked him about his share. He became evasive, stressed. He said the big transfer he was expecting hadn't arrived yet. There was a delay with the bank. A client payment was held up. It was a cascade of excuses. He looked genuinely panicked, which, foolishly, made me feel empathy for him. Poor guy. Stressed about work, his money tied up. So, what did I do? I covered the whole expense myself, drawing from my savings. He promised, profusely, to pay me back with interest the minute the money came through. He never did. Red flag number 13. A major one this time, involving my own savings. This pattern continued, periods of apparent financial ease, followed by sudden, urgent needs for cash, elaborate excuses about delayed funds, and me stepping in to cover things, always with his promise of imminent repayment that rarely materialized. My own savings, which I had worked hard to build, started slowly dwindling, covering what should have been his share of expenses. I started feeling resentful, stressed about money myself, which was something I hadn't experienced before him. I tried talking to him about it more forcefully, saying I was worried about our finances, worried about dipping into savings. He'd get defensive, sometimes even angry. He'd accuse me of not trusting him, of not understanding the complexities, of his job, of questioning his ability to provide for us. He'd turn it back on me, making me feel like the problem for bringing it up. This was classic gaslighting, making me doubt my own valid concerns and trust his distorted reality instead. The financial facade was cracking, visibly, but I was still trying to hold it together with my own dwindling funds and a mountain of rationalizations. I didn't understand the full scale of the issue yet. I thought it was maybe bad financial management, or perhaps a less successful job than he initially let on. Maybe he wasn't as rich as he seemed. I didn't grasp that the entire premise of his financial life, like the premise of his family life, was built on absolute quicksand. I was living with someone who was supposed to be a financial expert, and our reality was a constant, low-grade financial emergency, propped up by my own increasingly depleted resources. The excuses for this, and for everything else, were about to reach critical mass. The excuses, oh God, the excuses. They became the soundtrack to my life. Every time something didn't add up, the invisible family, the financial chaos, the secretive phone calls, the lack of personal history, there was a ready explanation. And they were always just convincing enough, just detailed enough, to make me pause, to make me want to believe him. He was a master weaver of words, spinning intricate tales to cover the gaping holes in his story. The phone secrecy, for example. It didn't lessen after we moved in. It intensified. He'd get calls at all hours, whispering into the receiver in the other room. He'd step outside onto the balcony, even in the heat or cold. If his phone pinged with a message, he'd snatch it up like it was a live grenade. My requests to see his phone, even playfully like, "Who are you texting?" were met with a firm but polite refusal. "Work stuff, honey, confidential," or "just the guys from the firm, boring stuff." If I pressed even a little, he'd get that guarded look, a subtle shift in his demeanor that communicated, "Do not cross this line." And because I didn't want to seem untrusting or demanding, I'd back down. Red flag number 14, a locked box right in front of my face. The work travel also continued, always vaguely described. Client meeting in Chicago, training in Denver, site visit out west. He rarely told me which client, which site, which hotel he was staying at. He'd leave, sometimes for just a day, sometimes for several. Communication would drop off significantly when he was gone, just sporadic texts. When he returned, he'd be exhausted, full of vague stories about stressful meetings and long hours. I never saw travel itineraries, boarding passes, or hotel confirmations unless I specifically requested them, and even then, they'd often be digital confirmations on his phone that he'd quickly show me, making it hard to see details or printouts that looked generic. It always felt like I was getting a filtered, curated version of his travel. Red flag number 15, the constant fog around his movements. The financial excuses were relentless, as I mentioned in the last section. The delayed transfers, the clients who hadn't paid, the investments that were temporarily illiquid. They were always plausible-sounding issues within the world of high finance he claimed to inhabit. He'd use jargon, talk about market fluctuations, regulatory delays, things that were outside my understanding, making me feel unqualified to question him. "It's complicated. You wouldn't understand the specifics," he'd say, not unkindly, but in a way that shut down further questions and reinforced his position as the financial expert. Red flag number 16, weaponizing his supposed expertise to deflect scrutiny, and the family excuses just kept piling up. The sister's baby was born, finally, but then the baby was colicky, or the sister was recovering, or the parents were helping them out. Then the parents' RV trip was extended again, or they had a health scare. Always conveniently timed when I suggested visiting. His brother, the park ranger, seemed to be single-handedly managing every remote park in the country, always inaccessible. The excuses were layers deep, and he delivered them with such sincerity, such conviction, that it was incredibly hard to doubt. He'd sometimes express genuine-sounding frustration or sadness that we couldn't visit, which made me feel like I was doubting his feelings, not just his explanations. Beyond the big things like family, money, and work, there were smaller inconsistencies, little lies that popped up and were quickly smoothed over with an excuse. He'd mentioned knowing someone who worked at a specific company I mentioned, but later couldn't recall their name or details. He'd talk about a past event he attended, but the dates wouldn't quite line up if I thought about it. These were tiny thread pulls, easily dismissed, but they contributed to a growing, unsettling feeling that the fabric of his story wasn't as tightly woven as it appeared. My gut was screaming louder now. The whispers were becoming insistent shouts. Something was seriously wrong. The sheer volume and complexity of the excuses were becoming exhausting. It felt like I was constantly navigating a maze of justifications. Why was so much of his life a secret? Why were there so many reasons why I couldn't meet his family? see his work life, understand his finances, or verify anything about his past. But the rationalizations were still fighting back. Maybe he had a difficult past he wasn't ready to share. Maybe his family had some major issues he was protecting me from. Maybe he had massive debt from before me that he was ashamed of. Maybe his high-pressure job really was that secretive and demanding. I bent over backwards to find explanations that didn't involve him being a fundamentally dishonest person. Because the thought that the man I loved, the man I lived with, the man I envisioned marrying was a liar. It was too devastating. It would mean everything. The connection, the shared dreams, the feeling of safety and love was potentially fake. So I kept quiet. I swallowed the questions that clawed at my throat. I accepted the excuses, added them to the mental pile. I smiled and pretended everything was fine, that I completely believed the latest story about the delayed wire transfer or the sick aunt who required his parents' full attention. I was becoming complicit in the narrative, enabling his secrecy, by not demanding the truth. I was living in a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance, holding two conflicting realities in my head. The loving, perfect partner who wanted a future with me, and the secretive stranger whose life was a carefully constructed black box. And the stress of trying to keep these two realities from colliding was immense. I was heading for a breaking point. I just didn't know it yet. I was so focused on surviving the present, on not rocking the boat, that I didn't see the massive wave of truth that was building, ready to crash down and wash away the entire elaborate sandcastle he had built. And the next wave was going to come in the form of a ring. So I was drowning in excuses, right? Living with this constant hum of something's off, rationalizing it all away because the alternative was just too painful to contemplate. My gut was screaming. The financial oddities were mounting. The family remained a total mystery, and every conversation felt like navigating a minefield of potential inconsistencies. And yet, despite all of that, despite the fact that I was literally living with a man whose life felt like a black box, the conversation about getting married, about a future that felt increasingly like a carefully constructed fantasy, it kept going. And then he proposed. It happened about 2 years into our relationship, maybe a year or so after we moved in together. Things had been particularly stressful with the financial weirdness leading up to it. There had been another episode of him needing money for some urgent, vague, work-related issue, another promise of a large transfer arriving any day now. I had reluctantly covered it again, dipping further into my savings, feeling that familiar mix of resentment and weary resignation. We'd had a tense conversation about it, one where I'd tried again to express my worry, and he'd, again, turned it into me not trusting him. The air had been thick with unspoken tension for a few days. And then, completely out of the blue, he planned this perfect romantic evening. He booked a table at this fancy restaurant we loved, the one with the skyline view. He was dressed immaculately, charming, attentive, like the man I'd first fallen for, minus the underlying current of stress I'd grown accustomed to seeing in his eyes. He talked about how much he loved me, how happy I made him, how he couldn't imagine his life without me. He revisited all those shared dreams we had, the house, the family, the future. He looked so sincere, so earnest. And then, over dessert, he reached across the table, took my hand, and pulled out a ring box. My breath caught in my throat. It was happening. The thing we'd talked about. The next step. The ultimate commitment. He got down on one knee, right there in the restaurant, and asked me to marry him. The ring was beautiful, a classic design, exactly something I would have picked out. He said it was a family stone, passed down through generations of sterling women. He told a sweet story about his grandmother wearing it, and in that moment, looking at his face, the beautiful ring, the romantic setting, all the doubts, all the red flags, all the whispers in my gut, they just evaporated. Or rather, they were drowned out by the sheer emotional force of the moment. This was it, the proposal, the confirmation that he wanted forever with me. This felt real. This felt permanent. This felt like love winning. I said yes, of course. Tears were streaming down my face. The restaurant staff brought champagne. Other diners applauded. It was magical. He looked so happy, so relieved. He kept holding my hand, kissing me, telling me how much he loved me. And for a little while, caught up in the euphoria, I allowed myself to believe that everything was going to be okay, that the doubts were just my own insecurities, that the secrecy was just his private nature or his demanding job, that the financial issues were temporary and would sort themselves out now that we were committed to a future together. The proposal felt like a promise, not just of marriage, but of clarity, of the black box finally opening. Surely he wouldn't ask me to marry him, to build a life with him, if his foundation was built on lies. Surely he would want to start our marriage with honesty. But even in the glow of the moment, a tiny flicker of that familiar unease sparked. When I asked about the ring being a family heirloom, wanting to know more about his grandmother, the story was brief, lacking the kind of warm, specific details most people share about beloved grandparents. It was like he'd memorized a line about a family stone without knowing the character who owned it. And when we talked about telling our families, he was enthusiastic about telling my family, suggesting we call my parents right away. But when I asked about his family, the same old hesitations crept in. "Oh, I'll tell them tomorrow," he'd say. Or, "Let me call my parents first. They're traditional. I want to tell them privately." More delays. More keeping his family side of things separate. We called my parents that night. They were overjoyed. Crying, laughing, so happy for us. So happy he was joining our family. It felt wonderful to share that joy with them. But his side remained silent. When I asked him the next day if he'd told his parents, he said yes. They were thrilled. Couldn't wait to celebrate. But there was no follow-up call with them for me. No excited texts from an unknown sister congratulating me. No attempt to connect their excitement with my reality. Just his word. And that tiny flicker of unease grew back into a quiet hum. The ring itself, while beautiful, also triggered a small moment of weirdness. We had talked about engagement rings hypothetically before, and I knew his supposed financial situation wasn't exactly overflowing with cash, despite his claims of success. The ring looked expensive, like very expensive. When I commented on how generous he was, especially given his recent cash flow issues, he brushed it off, saying the transfer he was waiting on had finally come through just in time. A convenient explanation, perfectly timed to explain the sudden appearance of a pricey ring. Red flag number 17, shining brightly on my finger. A symbol of commitment purchased with potentially questionable funds or obtained via another layer of deception. The proposal was everything I had dreamed of, and yet it was also layered, with the same familiar pattern of secrecy and vague explanations that had permeated our relationship. I was engaged to the man I loved, the man who seemed to offer a perfect future, but the foundation of that future still felt unstable, built on stories I couldn't verify and people I couldn't meet. The romantic high was powerful, but it couldn't completely silence the little voice asking, who was I really marrying? What was the truth behind the perfect facade? The proposal was the romantic climax of the courtship, but for me, it marked the beginning of a period where the pressure to ignore the red flags intensified exponentially because now, planning a wedding, the stakes felt higher than ever before. Okay. So I said yes. I was engaged. It was supposed to be the happiest time, right? All the excitement of picking a date, choosing a venue, dress shopping, planning the celebration of us. And for a while, there was that excitement. My friends were thrilled. My family was over the moon. I dived into wedding planning with gusto. But the stress of planning a wedding, which is already considerable, was magnified 1,000 times by the constant low-grade anxiety caused by David's continued secrecy, and the lies that started tangling themselves up in the wedding details. The guest list was an immediate source of stress. Mine was easy. Family, friends, colleagues. David's side was sparse. He only had a handful of names. When I pressed him for more, college friends, childhood friends from Willow Creek, cousins. The excuses flowed like water. His college friends were scattered. We weren't doing a huge wedding. He was closer to my friends now anyway. He wanted it to be intimate. He'd list a couple of names, maybe 3 or 4 buddies he'd occasionally mention, none of whom I'd ever met, none of whom lived in Dallas. And then there was the family guest list. His immediate family, parents, sister, brother, were the only ones he listed. 4 people. When I asked about aunts, uncles, cousins, he'd say he wasn't close to them. They lived too far away. It was expensive for them to travel. It struck me as incredibly odd for someone who painted a picture of a close-knit small-town family. My family alone was 40 or 50 people. His entire guest list, including his 4 immediate family members and handful of vague friends, barely broke 10 people. It felt like he didn't have anyone to invite. Red flag number 18, starkly visible on the spreadsheet. Planning anything that required family involvement became a nightmare. The traditional things, like our parents meeting, or them contributing to the wedding costs if they wanted to, or just being involved. My parents were lovely, offering help, excited to meet his family. I'd try to coordinate a dinner, a video call, anything. And David would have an excuse every single time. His parents were busy, traveling, not feeling well. His sister couldn't leave the baby. His brother was somewhere remote, being a park ranger. The story about his parents contributing financially also got weird. My parents offered some help, which we gratefully accepted. I asked David if his parents planned to contribute, not because we needed the money, but because it felt like a natural part of the merging of families. He was cagey. He said his parents were old school and preferred to give us a gift directly, maybe put money towards a down payment on a house after the wedding, rather than contribute to the wedding itself. It was another plausible explanation, but it conveniently avoided any situation that would require his parents to actually do something that would prove their existence or their financial status. Red flag number 19. Choosing a wedding. Date involved its own set of excuses. I had some dates in mind, considering venue availability and my family's schedules. David was hesitant about certain times of year, always citing potential busy periods for his work. He made it seem like his job had incredibly unpredictable, non-negotiable travel or project deadlines that could pop up at any moment. We finally landed on a date, but the process felt like navigating a minefield of his unseen, unverified professional obligations. Then came the wedding website. Everyone has one now, right? A place to put photos, tell your story, share details. I wanted to put up pictures of us, tell the story of how we met, how we proposed. I asked him for photos of him growing up, photos of his family, maybe some pictures of Willow Creek. And guess what? He didn't have any. Or he had a handful of blurry, generic photos he claimed were from his childhood. No family members clearly identifiable. He had absolutely no digital photos of his family, no old photo albums he could share. His excuse? His parents weren't tech-savvy. They didn't take many pictures. All their photos were physical and packed away somewhere back in Willow Creek. It felt incredibly flimsy. Red flag number 20. A glaring absence in a digital world. How does a successful man in his mid-30s have literally zero digital footprint of his family or childhood? The stress was getting to me. I was trying to plan this joyful event, but I felt like I was constantly hitting walls whenever it came to his past or his family. I started feeling like I was planning a wedding for Mina and a ghost. My friends would ask about meeting his family at the wedding, and I'd have to make excuses echoing the ones he gave me. It was embarrassing. It felt like I was defending his secrecy, becoming part of the deception myself. His behavior was also erratic. Sometimes he'd be super involved and excited about the wedding plans, looking at invitations, tasting cakes. Other times, he'd be withdrawn, stressed, glued to his phone, taking hushed calls, clearly preoccupied with whatever was going on in his hidden life. Likely the financial issues that still bubbled beneath the surface. He seemed more stressed about the wedding than excited, which I tried to rationalize as the pressure of commitment, or maybe his demanding job bleeding into his personal life. We had to provide names for the wedding license, for the officiant, for various vendors. Every time I filled out a form with his name, David Sterling, and his supposed details, a little voice whispered, "Are you sure about this?" The lack of verification for his past, the inability to produce basic things like family photos or even a solid list of friends, was becoming deafening. The charming narrative he'd spun was unraveling thread by thread under the pressure of practical planning. I went back and forth in my head constantly. Was I being paranoid? Was this just how some people were? Was I overthinking things? Was this normal wedding stress amplified by my own anxieties? He still told me he loved me every day. He was still kind and supportive in many ways. He still painted that picture of our future together. That's what I focused on. I clung to the idea that once we were married, maybe the secrecy would ease. Maybe then he'd feel secure enough to fully open up, to integrate his past and his family into our shared life. Maybe the wedding itself would be the catalyst for truth and openness. That hope, that desperate wish, kept me going, kept me pushing through the stress and the mounting pile of red flags. I was walking down the aisle towards a man I loved, desperately hoping that the person waiting for me at the end was truly who he said he was. The wedding day was looming, and I was stepping closer and closer to binding myself legally and emotionally to a man I realized, deep down, I still didn't fully know. The wedding day. August. Invent a date. Maybe mid-month for summer. Invent a year consistent with the timeline. 6 years ago was first meeting. 2 years ago was proposal, so 4 years ago. The culmination of everything, the moment I was supposed to become Mrs. David Sterling, the start of our forever. I woke up feeling a whirlwind of emotions. Excitement, joy, anticipation, but also, lurking beneath it all, that familiar knot of anxiety. Today was the day. Today, the two halves of our lives, mine and his, would officially merge. Or at least, my life would merge with the one he presented. Getting ready with my bridesmaids, my mom, my sister, felt magical. The usual wedding day. Chaos, hair, makeup, flowers, laughter, a few happy tears. They were all so happy for me. They loved David. They saw the man he presented, charming, successful, devoted. They had no idea about the secret life, the excuses, the financial weirdness, the invisible family. I had kept it all to myself, buried deep beneath layers of hope and denial, not wanting to worry them, not wanting to voice the doubts that felt disloyal even to think. The ceremony was beautiful. We got married in a lovely venue, a garden setting with string lights. My family and friends were all there, faces beaming. And there was David, waiting for me at the altar. He looked handsome, a little nervous, but his eyes, when they met mine, seemed full of love. For that moment, walking towards him, surrounded by everyone who loved me, I allowed myself to believe. I pushed every doubt, every red flag, every unanswered question into a tiny box in the furthest corner of my mind. This was real. This was happening. He was my person. But even as I stood there, saying my vows, looking into his eyes, the reality of his hidden life was present in its absence. My side of the ceremony was full. Parents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, friends. His side? A handful of people. His parents were supposedly there, somewhere in the first row, but they were strangers to me, just two older faces I had never met before today. The sister with the colicky baby, the brother the park ranger. They were also supposedly present, vaguely pointed out in the small group of his guests by one of the few people he introduced me to from his side, maybe a distant cousin. Moments before the ceremony started. It was a fleeting, awkward introduction, names I barely registered, faces I couldn't place. They seemed nice enough, but also unfamiliar, like people playing a role. Red flag number 21, on my wedding day, the most obvious one yet. His entire family felt like strangers, like people who had materialized just for this event. During the reception, the contrast was even more stark. My family and friends mingling, laughing, sharing stories about me. His small group of guests, sticking together, polite but reserved. There were no embarrassing childhood stories shared by his best man. He didn't have one, just a vague witness. No heartfelt toasts from his parents reminiscing about his upbringing. They gave a very short, generic toast about happiness. It was all surface level, polite, distant. It felt like two separate weddings happening in the same room. Mine, full of history and connection, and his, a small, curated production with actors playing the part of his loved ones. I tried to make conversation with his parents, asking about Willow Creek, about his childhood. Their answers were polite but vague, echoing David's own evasiveness. They seemed nice, yes, but also disconnected. Like they didn't actually know the stories David had told me. Or maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe they were just reserved. Maybe the wedding day was overwhelming. My rationalizations were working overtime, desperately trying to make the reality fit the narrative. David himself seemed happy, maybe a little preoccupied, but overall present and smiling. He danced with me, talked to my family, played the part of the loving groom perfectly. He looked at me with such affection, said my wife with such pride. It was confusing. How could someone who seemed to genuinely love me, genuinely want this life with me, also be living such a seemingly elaborate lie about who he was and where he came from? The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. There was one moment during the reception that stands out. My dad, giving his toast, mentioned how happy he was that I'd found David, how he was so proud to welcome him into our family. He said something specific about David's supposed background, maybe referencing his job or his hometown in a way that showed he truly believed David's story. And I saw David flinch, just slightly, a flicker of something unreadable, crossing his face before the practiced smile snapped back into place. It was gone in an instant. Maybe something only I, tuned into his subtle shifts, would notice. But I noticed it. And in that instant, a cold wave washed over me. He wasn't just hiding things. He was actively maintaining a performance. Even on our wedding day, he was performing for my family, for my friends, for me. Red flag number 22, a chilling confirmation of the facade. Walking out of the reception, hand in hand with my new husband, felt surreal. I was married. I had the ring, the photos, the legal document. I had married the man I loved. But, deep down, that screaming gut instinct, temporarily silenced by the romance and the sheer momentum of the day, was starting to re-emerge, louder and more insistent than ever. I had married David Sterling, the charming, successful man from Willow Creek. But standing there, in my wedding dress, holding his hand, I knew with terrifying certainty that the man I had just married was not the man he had spent the last 2 years pretending to be. And the reality of settling into married life, with this profound, unsettling unknown at its core, was about to become far more challenging and far more revealing than I could have ever imagined. So, we were married. Mr. and Mrs. David Sterling. It felt both completely real and utterly surreal at the same time. We took a short honeymoon, just a week away, a chance to decompress after the wedding stress. And honestly, the honeymoon was mostly great. He was relaxed, attentive, the charming man I'd fallen in love with. For those 7 days, I managed to push the unease back down. I told myself the wedding weirdness was just wedding stress, that his family was just private, that now, as husband and wife, things would shift. We were building our future, legally bound. Surely the secrets would fade away now. Yeah, about that married life, settling back into our home, my home technically still, didn't bring the clarity or openness I had desperately hoped for. If anything, it magnified the existing issues. The comfortable rhythm of living together was still there, the shared routines, the physical closeness. But the black box that was David's background, his work, his finances, it didn't open. It just seemed to seal tighter. The phone secrecy continued, sometimes felt worse. It was always on silent, always face down. He'd leave the room for calls, whispering. If I came near, he'd visibly stiffen, quickly end the conversation, or switch screens on his phone. It wasn't just the frequency, it was the feeling around it. It felt furtive, like he was constantly on guard, constantly hiding something crucial. I started noticing he'd clear his browser history religiously. His laptop was password protected, and he never used it when I was nearby. These weren't the habits of someone with a standard above-board job, no matter how confidential. Red flag number 23, now living with me 24/7. His work hours remained erratic. Sometimes he'd be gone all day, supposedly at the office or client sites, but he rarely mentioned specific locations or people. Other days he'd be home, vaguely working from the couch, but the actual work seemed minimal. He never had. Colleagues call him at the house. He didn't participate in video calls for work that I ever saw. His work felt like a performance that only happened behind closed doors, or when he was out of the house. The concept of Pinnacle Capital started feeling less like a real company and more like a convenient cover story for whatever he was actually doing. And the financial weirdness? It was our constant companion in married life. Now that we were married, he seemed to feel more comfortable asking me for money or suggesting we pool funds for things, always with the promise of when my next big transfer comes through. His credit card balances seemed astronomical. He'd get calls from numbers he didn't recognize and let them go to voicemail looking stressed. Sometimes, actual collection notices would arrive, discreetly addressed, but noticeable if you were paying attention. When I asked, it was always a convoluted story about an old debt that was supposed to be settled, a mistake by the bank, a client who stiffed him. The explanations became more and more complex, requiring more and more mental gymnastics to believe. Red flag number 24, now impacting our shared financial stability, or rather, the stability of my finances, which were increasingly propping things up. He still never suggested visiting his family. The excuses continued, evolving as the hypothetical situations in Willow Creek shifted. His parents were downsizing and too busy. His sister's baby had health issues. The colicky baby excuse lasted an unbelievably long time, y'all. His brother was now on a multi-year assignment in Alaska, or something equally remote. The vague relatives I had supposedly met at the wedding? They vanished back into the ether, no follow-up, no attempts to connect. It felt like they had been hired actors for the day. Red flag number 25. That persistent, gaping hole where his family should have been. Living with the constant undercurrent of secrecy and the financial stress started to take a serious toll on me. I felt like I was living with a stranger, even though he was my husband. He was right there, sharing my bed, eating dinner at my table, talking about our future. But so much of his present and all of his past were locked away. I couldn't reconcile the loving husband with the secretive man whose life felt like a mirage. I started feeling isolated, unable to talk to my friends or family about the depth of my unease. How do you tell your loved ones that you think you married a man whose entire identity might be fake It sounded insane. I was afraid they'd think I was going crazy. The emotional toll was immense. I was constantly on edge, trying to notice things, trying to piece together the puzzle, but also trying to appear normal, to pretend everything was fine. The rationalizations were harder to maintain now that I was seeing this level of secrecy and financial instability on a daily basis. The whispers in my gut weren't whispers anymore. They were a dull roar. But confronting him directly felt impossible. His reactions to my earlier, gentle questions had shown me that. He could deflect, deny, and turn it back on me, making me feel like the problem. I started looking at his things when he wasn't around. This felt wrong, a violation of trust, but I was desperate. I'd look through his wallet when he was in the shower, hoping to see an old ID, a different address, anything. I'd glance at his mail more closely before he snatched it up. I was becoming a detective in my own home, fueled by a desperate need to understand who I had married. It was a miserable way to live, constantly feeling suspicious of the person you loved. The contrast between the man he presented to the outside world, the charming, successful, confident guy my friends and family saw, and the man I lived with, secretive, stressed about money, vague about everything important, was jarring. It felt like I was living with two different people, and the real one was hidden somewhere beneath layers of performance. This period of settling into married life wasn't a honeymoon phase. It was a phase of quiet desperation. It was the slow, dawning horror that the red flags hadn't been isolated incidents or quirks. They were fundamental aspects of a carefully constructed facade. I was married to the facade. And the cracks were starting to show, not just as whispers, but as tangible proof that I was about to stumble upon. Proof that would shatter the fragile peace I was trying so desperately to maintain. The reality of his secretive world wasn't just an abstract feeling anymore. It was about to become concrete, undeniable evidence that would change everything. That simmering unease I was living with, the constant feeling of being on edge, married to a man who felt like a stranger, it needed something concrete to make it real, to push me past the point of rationalization and denial. And that something came in the form of a seemingly insignificant piece of paper. It was maybe 6 or 8 months into our marriage. David was traveling for one of his vaguely defined client meetings out of state. I was doing some tidying up in our home office, which was mostly my space, but he had a desk there too, always kept neat and conspicuously free of anything personal or identifiable. I was putting away some of my own files when a small, unopened envelope slipped from a stack of papers on his desk. It wasn't addressed to our house, or to any of the P.O. boxes he'd mentioned. It was addressed to a different address entirely, one I didn't recognize, in a different part of town, not even near his old apartment. And the name on the envelope wasn't David Sterling. It was something slightly different. Let's call it David Carter. Red flag number 26. Fluttering right there in my hand, no longer invisible. My heart started pounding. David Carter? Who was that? And why was mail addressed to him coming here, mixed in with David Sterling's papers? The envelope was from a bank I'd never heard him mention before. It wasn't from one of the companies whose statements he was constantly shuffling away. I know I shouldn't have. I knew it was wrong. But every single rationalization I'd ever made, every swallowed doubt, every instance of his secrecy culminated in this moment. I had to know. I carefully, my hands trembling, opened the envelope. Inside was a statement for a savings account. A small savings account, almost empty, but active recently. The name on the account was David Carter. The address was the one on the envelope, the one I didn't recognize. And the dates on the statement covered a period about a year before I met him. But there was a withdrawal, a relatively small one, that looked recent. It wasn't earth-shattering proof of massive fraud. It wasn't evidence of a whole other family or a criminal past. It was just a small savings account, under a different name, at a different address. But it was undeniable proof that David Sterling was not the only name he used, and that he had active ties to places and identities he had never, ever mentioned to me. I felt dizzy. David Carter. Why? Why would he have an account under a different name? Was it an alias? A previous name? Was it linked to the secrets he kept? This wasn't just being private anymore. This was deliberate concealment, a separate identity existing alongside the one he presented to the world, to me. I put the statement back in the envelope, put the envelope back exactly where I found it. My mind was racing. David Carter. The name echoed in my head. It felt like a key to a door I didn't know existed. This wasn't a vague feeling. It was concrete evidence. A bank statement, a different name, a different address. Small, yes, but undeniable. Over the next few weeks, I was on hyper alert. I started looking more carefully, less like a suspicious wife and more like someone trying to find puzzle pieces. I didn't actively search his things when he was home. The guilt and fear were too strong. But when he was traveling or out for one of his late work nights, I'd look. It felt dirty, like I was betraying him, but the feeling of having been lied to, potentially on a fundamental level, overrode the guilt. I found another small piece of evidence a little while later. Tucked away in a drawer, under a pile of socks, was an old driver's license. It wasn't current. It was expired. And the address on it was, you guessed it, that same unfamiliar address from the bank statement. The name on it was David Sterling. But the photo looked younger, and the issue date was years before he claimed to have moved to Dallas. It contradicted the timeline he'd given me about living in Denver before Dallas. It wasn't the David Carter name, but it was another inconsistency tied to that other address, another crack in the timeline of his life story. Red flag number 27. These weren't the grand, sweeping revelations you see in movies. They were small, unsettling details. A bank statement under a different name. An expired license with a timeline that didn't match his story. Mail going to different addresses. On their own, maybe plausible with the right string of complex excuses. But together, they painted a picture of a life that was far more complicated and far less transparent than he had ever let on. They were solid proof that the man I married was actively concealing parts of his identity and his history. Finding these small pieces of evidence was terrifying and validating all at once. Validating because my gut had been right. Something was off. He was hiding things. Terrifying because it meant the depth of the deception was greater than I had imagined. And if he was lying about something as simple as a bank account name or his address history, what else was he lying about? The invisible family? The prestigious job? The entire story of Willow Creek? I couldn't unsee what I had found. The innocence was gone. I was no longer navigating vague doubts and rationalizations. I was navigating concrete proof of small lies, small pieces of a larger hidden puzzle. And the next step, the terrifying step, was to confront him, to show him what I found, and demand the truth. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew he was a master of deflection. But I couldn't keep living with the knowledge of these lies, silently playing detective in my own marriage. The small lies had been exposed, and I needed to understand what they meant and what other, bigger lies they were covering up. The confrontation was coming, and I knew, deep down, it wouldn't give me the answers I desperately needed, but would instead lead me further into the labyrinth of his deception. Holding that bank statement and the expired driver's license felt like holding evidence in a trial, except the trial was my marriage. I couldn't keep quiet about it. The knowledge was burning a hole inside me. I had to confront him. I waited until he was home during a quiet moment after dinner. I felt sick with nerves. My hands were clammy. I practiced in my head how I would approach it, calm, non-accusatory, just presenting the facts and asking for an explanation. I didn't want to fight. I wanted the truth. Hey, David, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. I was tidying the office the other day and I found this. I held out the envelope with the bank statement addressed to David Carter at the unfamiliar address. His face, usually so controlled, faltered for just a split second. A flash of surprise, then something unreadable. Was it fear? Annoyance? But just as quickly, the familiar mask slipped back into place. His expression became neutral, then slightly wary. "What's this?" he asked, taking the envelope from me. He glanced at the address, then the name, then the bank name. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it was. "It's a bank statement," I said, my voice a little shaky now. "From bank name, invent one, e.g., Coastline Savings. Addressed to David Carter at address found on envelope. And I found this too." I then pulled out the expired driver's license. "This has that same address, and it's older than when you said you moved to Dallas." I looked at him, searching his face for any sign of honesty, any hint of the loving husband who would explain things to his wife. But his expression hardened. He didn't look caught. He looked calculating. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his tone cool, distant. The question wasn't, "What are these?" or, "Let me explain." It was an immediate pivot, an accusation. "They were on your desk," I said, feeling defensive now. "Accidentally, but that's not the point, David." "Who is David?" "Carter? And why is there mail addressed to you under that name, at an address you've never mentioned? And why does this license contradict your story about moving here?" He sighed, a heavy, put-upon sigh. He didn't meet my eyes directly. He looked away, towards the window. "You were going through my things?" he asked, ignoring my questions completely. "I wasn't going through. Your things I was tidying, and it fell out," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "But even if I was, isn't it more concerning that you have mail coming here for someone else, under a different name?" Then came the deflection, the gaslighting. "David Carter is... It's a long story," he said, still avoiding my gaze. "It's related to some old business stuff, something that's completely resolved now. An old professional alias I used for a specific project a while back." "An alias?" I was stunned. "You used an alias? Why? For what?" "It was confidential client work," he said, turning back to me, his voice firm now, regaining his composure. "In my line of work, sometimes you have to compartmentalize things, maintain client confidentiality. It was a requirement for that specific project. It's completely innocent, legally sound, but it's sensitive. I didn't tell you because it was in the past, and it's complicated, and honestly, it's boring work stuff." He picked up the bank statement envelope again, turning it over in his hands. "This must be some residual mail, maybe a final statement they sent to an old address associated with that alias. It's nothing. And the license? That address? Oh, that must be from when I was briefly living there during that project. I forgot I even had that old license." He dismissed it all so smoothly, so calmly. An alias for a confidential project, a residual bank statement, a forgotten old license from a temporary address. Each explanation, on its own, felt almost believable within the fake world of high-stakes finance he'd created. He wove the details together quickly, confidently. But it didn't sit right. It felt too convenient, too rehearsed. "An alias? For a bank account?" I pressed. "And you just happened to forget about having a driver's license with a different address than the one you said you were living at?" His demeanor shifted again. The calm veneer cracked slightly, revealing frustration, annoyance. "Why are you digging into this?" he asked, his voice sharp. "It's in the past. It's dealt with. It's work. Confidential work. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You're going through my things, questioning my job. Don't you trust me? And there it was, the classic gaslighting tactic, turning my valid questions, my evidence, into a character flaw in me. I was the one who was untrusting, invasive, paranoid. My reaction to finding undeniable proof of secrecy became the problem, not his secrecy itself. Of course I want to trust you, I said, my voice trembling. But you have mail under a different name, at an address you never told me about. And this license doesn't make sense with what you told me about living in Denver. There are just so many things that don't add up, David. The family I never meet, the finances that are always a mess despite your job, the constant secrecy. This feels like another piece of that. He walked over to me, trying a different tactic. He reached out, tried to take my hands. Honey, he said, his voice softening, returning to the loving husband tone. But it felt forced. I know some things about my job are complicated, and maybe I'm not always the best at explaining it. But you are my wife. I love you. That David, Carter's stuff is just old, complicated work history. It has nothing to do with us. Please let it go. You're stressing yourself out over nothing. You're just seeing things that aren't there because you're worried. He was trying to soothe me, to make me feel like I was overreacting, like my concerns were a product of my own anxiety, not his actions. He was leveraging my love for him, my desire for our marriage to be happy and normal, to shut down my questions. It was incredibly disorienting. I was holding physical proof of a lie, but he was making me feel like I was the one who was wrong, who was damaging our relationship by bringing it up. The confrontation ended with him dismissing the evidence, reiterating his vague, convenient explanation, and making me feel guilty for having even looked or questioned him. He collected the statement and the license, saying he'd deal with them. I never saw them again. I didn't get clarity. I didn't get honesty. I got deflection, denial, and gaslighting. He masterfully turned the situation around, making me feel like the problem. I was left feeling more confused, more isolated, and more certain than ever that he was hiding something massive, but also feeling powerless to uncover it. My attempts at confrontation had failed. He had reinforced his walls, and I was left standing outside, holding the pieces of truth he refused to acknowledge, feeling utterly alone in my growing certainty that my entire marriage was built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. The small lies were confirmed, but the man behind them remained shrouded in secrecy, and my efforts to peel back the layers had only pushed him further away. That confrontation about David Carter and the old driver's license. It didn't go the way I'd hoped. Not even close. I thought presenting him with tangible proof, something undeniable, would force him to drop the act, to finally tell me the truth. Instead, it just showed me how deep his defenses were, how skilled he was at twisting reality. He didn't just deny, he deflected, he minimized, he accused me of being untrusting and invasive. He turned my legitimate concerns about finding mail, for a different person, under a different name, at a different address, into my failing. And it worked. Not that I believed his flimsy explanation about a confidential professional alias, not for a second. But his reaction, the way he shut down, the way he made me feel guilty and paranoid. It was incredibly effective at shutting me down. I walked away from that conversation feeling defeated, unheard, and more alone than ever before. The failure of that confrontation sent me into a tailspin of isolation. How could I talk about this? How do you explain to your friends or family that you found evidence your husband might be using an alias, and when you asked him about it, he turned it around and made you feel crazy? It sounded utterly unbelievable. I could just imagine the conversations. So, I think David might not be who he says he is. I found this bank statement, and then having to explain his smooth deflection. They'd probably try to reassure me, tell me I was overthinking, just like he wanted me to believe. They saw the charming, successful David Sterling he presented to them. They didn't see the man who took hushed calls in another room, the man whose story didn't quite add up, the man who became a brick wall when questioned. So I kept it all inside. The knowledge about David Carter, the unanswered questions, the crushing weight of suspicion. It sat in my chest like a lead weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to act normal. I felt trapped in my own home, married to a stranger. We were living together, sharing a life on the surface. But emotionally, I was completely walled off, unable to share the terrifying secret that was consuming me. Being married to someone you suspect is living a double life is an exhausting existence. Every interaction, every conversation felt like a performance. I was performing the role of the happy wife, trying to hide the turmoil churning inside me. He was performing the role of the loving husband with a demanding, secretive job, trying to hide whatever massive truth was buried beneath the layers of lies. It was like living in a play where both actors knew the script was fake, but were forced to deliver their lines anyway, constantly afraid of improvising or breaking character. The little things I'd noticed before, the phone secrecy, the vague travel, the invisible family, the financial weirdness, they weren't little things anymore. They were pieces of evidence, screaming at me constantly. Every time his phone pinged and he snatched it up, I wondered who David Carter was communicating with. Every time he went on a work trip, I wondered where he was really going and who he was really seeing. Every time he talked about his family in Willow Creek, the images felt hollow, like cardboard cutouts, knowing I'd supposedly met them at the wedding, and they'd felt like strangers. The financial situation was a constant agonizing source of stress. Despite his claims of a high salary and big deals, there was never enough money. My savings continued to be the safety net, quietly funding our lives when his transfers didn't arrive. The constant cycle of him needing money, offering vague excuses, promising repayment, and me covering expenses was financially draining, yes, but also soul-crushing. It felt like I wasn't just married to a lie, I was financially subsidizing it. Red flag number 28, now a deep, bleeding wound. The man who was supposed to be a financial expert was a financial disaster, and I was being dragged down with him. I started feeling physically unwell from the stress. Constant headaches, trouble sleeping, loss of appetite. My friends noticed I was quieter, less vibrant, but I brushed it off as just being stressed about work or married life adjustments. How could I tell them the truth? How could I say, hey, you know the guy you all love and approved of? Yeah, turns out I think he might be a complete fraud, possibly using a fake name, definitely lying about his job and his family, and slowly draining my bank account. It felt impossible. The gaslighting from the David Carter confrontation lingered. I kept questioning myself. Was I being paranoid? Was I blowing things out of proportion? Was my intuition completely wrong? He had made his explanation sound just plausible enough, just complex enough, referencing confidential professional aliases and compartmentalizing to plant a seed of doubt in my own judgment. Maybe this was just how things were in his world. Maybe I was the one who needed to adjust, to be more trusting, less suspicious. It's amazing how effectively someone can make you doubt your own sanity when they are a skilled manipulator. This period was marked by a profound sense of loneliness. I was married, living with my husband, yet I felt completely isolated with the enormous secret I carried. He was right there, but he was a stranger behind a facade. The emotional intimacy we had shared during the courtship and early days of living together seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a careful dance around the truth. The invisible family became an even bigger sore spot. Holidays would come around, and my family would invite us, excited to spend time with David, and every time, he'd have an excuse. He couldn't travel because of a last-minute work crisis, or we had already made plans he would conveniently make at the last minute to conflict. It meant I was often traveling to see my family alone, or we were celebrating holidays just the two of us, which felt increasingly hollow. My family would ask, gently, "How are David's parents? Will they be able to visit soon?" And I'd have to repeat his latest, increasingly unbelievable excuse, feeling a fresh wave of shame and sadness every time. It felt like his refusal to integrate me into his past was a constant, active rejection, a daily reminder that a huge part of his life was off limits to me, even as his wife. I wasn't living a marriage. I was living in a state of perpetual anxiety and emotional lockdown. The charming man was still there, in glimpses, but he was increasingly overshadowed by the secretive stranger who seemed constantly preoccupied with whatever hidden life he was living. The small piece of evidence I had found, the bank statement, the license, had cracked open the door to the truth just enough to show me there was something dark and complex hiding behind it, but not enough to give me the full picture or a clear path forward. I was stuck, frozen by fear and uncertainty, in a marriage that felt less and less like a partnership and more like a prison built of lies and secrets. The isolation was crushing, and I knew I couldn't live like this forever. Something had to give, and tragically the thing that gave next was our financial stability. Remember the financial weirdness I talked about? The constant need for money, the maxed out credit cards, the promises of transfers that never seemed to arrive? Well, that low-grade financial stress that had been simmering beneath the surface, for months quietly draining my savings, suddenly erupted into a full-blown crisis. The financial collapse hit like a brick wall, hard and fast, and it was the shock to my system I desperately needed to finally break free from the cycle of rationalization and denial. It happened maybe a year or so after we got married. Things had been particularly tight. David had been asking for money more frequently, for larger amounts, always with more urgent-sounding excuses, a business opportunity he couldn't miss, a tax issue that needed immediate resolution, a client payment that was significantly delayed. I had paid for almost everything for weeks, groceries, utilities, even our mortgage payments. My savings were seriously depleted. I was starting to panic. I finally put my foot down. I told him firmly, "David, I can't keep doing this. My savings are almost gone. We need to figure out what's going on with our finances. What about your salary? What about Pinnacle Capital?" He became agitated, defensive. He gave the usual lines about complex deals, temporary illiquidity, market fluctuations. But this time, his voice lacked the usual smooth confidence. There was an edge of desperation, a flicker of genuine panic in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. He promised, absolutely promised, that a massive transfer was coming in by the end of the week, the culmination of a huge deal he'd been working on for months, and everything would be fine. Better than fine. He just needed me to cover things one last time, for just a few more days. Against my better judgment, fueled by a desperate hope that this time he was telling the truth, that this huge transfer would finally solve everything and silence the screaming. Doubts about his financial reality? I found a way to scrape together enough money to cover the most pressing bills. It meant delaying some of my own payments, racking up a bit of debt myself. But I did it. I trusted him one last time. The end of the week came and went. No massive transfer. No relief. The bills were still unpaid. More demands for payment started, coming in, addressed to us, to our address, for things I didn't even know about. Unpaid credit card bills in his name with astronomical balances and penalty fees. Notices for overdue payments on loans I'd never heard of. Even some smaller debts to individuals. It wasn't just him being bad with money. It was a significant, systemic financial collapse, impacting our shared life. Red flag number 29, a full-blown financial crisis. I confronted him again, this time not about a vague alias, but about tangible, overdue bills with our address on them. "David, what is going on?" I demanded, showing him a stack of unopened bills, some marked final notice. Where is this money? What are these debts? What about the transfer you said was coming? He completely fell apart. The calm mask shattered. He paced, he stammered, he ran his hands through his hair. The elaborate excuses about deals and transfers crumbled. He finally admitted, he admitted some things. He admitted that the big transfer hadn't come through. He admitted that the financial situation was worse than he'd let on. He admitted he had some significant debts he'd been trying to manage. But even in his moment of apparent breakdown, he wasn't fully honest. He blamed external factors, a client who defaulted, an investment that went south unexpectedly, a business partner who screwed him over. He spun a story about a failed venture, something outside of his pinnacle capital job, which he still insisted was real, just not the source of this particular debt. He made himself out to be a victim of unfortunate circumstances, not the architect of the chaos. He promised to fix it. He'd sell some assets I'd never seen evidence of. He'd talk to the bank. He'd figure something out. He was desperate, panicking. And seeing him in that state, even though it was terrifying, also felt slightly more real than his usual polished facade. For a moment, I thought, maybe this is the truth. Maybe he just failed at a side venture and was too embarrassed to tell me. Maybe the Pinnacle Capital job was real, but not enough to cover this disaster. But the sheer scale of the debt indicated on those statements went far beyond a failed side project. And the total lack of assets he claimed to have, the constant struggle for liquid cash, didn't align even with the story of a regular job, let alone a high-paying one. It felt like another partial truth designed to cover a bigger lie. The financial collapse meant I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was staring at concrete evidence of significant overdue debts that were now my problem too, as his wife. My own financial security was directly threatened. This wasn't just about abstract doubts or a secret alias. This was about losing my home, my savings, my future. The fear was paralyzing, but it also ignited a fierce protective instinct. I had to understand the full picture. I couldn't keep blindly trusting his partial, ever-shifting explanations. The house became a place of intense financial anxiety. Calls from unknown numbers became more frequent, suspected collectors. Bills piled up faster than we could pay them. He was visibly stressed all the time, alternating between frantic promises to fix things and withdrawn silence. I tried to work with him, to sit down and go through everything, to make a plan. But he was either too panicked or too secretive to fully cooperate. He'd show me snippets of things, make vague claims about income, and then shut down the conversation. It was impossible to get a clear picture of the actual debt, where it came from, or what his true income, if any, was. This financial rock bottom was painful and terrifying, but it was also the turning point. The rationalizations about complicated finance and temporary issues were impossible to maintain in the face of this level of chaos. The facade was crumbling, and it was dragging me down into the rubble. I realized with chilling clarity that I couldn't rely on him to tell me the truth or to fix the situation. If I wanted answers, if I wanted to protect myself, I had to find them myself. The fear of what I might find was immense, but the fear of staying in the dark, of being destroyed by secrets I didn't understand, was greater. The financial collapse was the catalyst. It pushed me past fear and past denial. It made me realize that the only way out was to stop waiting for him to reveal the truth and to start actively searching for it myself. The investigation I had dreaded, the one I knew would confirm my worst fears, had to begin now. That financial collapse was the breaking point. It stripped away the last layers of my willingness to rationalize and enabled a fierce, desperate drive to protect myself. I realized I couldn't continue living in this state of uncertainty, married to a man whose life was a maze of secrets and who had just driven us, or rather, my finances, into the ground. I had to find out who he really was and what was really going on. The failed confrontation and the financial disaster had shown me I couldn't get the truth from him directly. He was too good at deflection, too invested in maintaining the facade, too willing to gaslight me into doubting myself. If I wanted answers, I had to become a detective. A secret detective in my own home, investigating my own husband. It felt wrong, a violation of trust. But trust had already been shattered into a million pieces. This was about survival now. I started small, carefully. My investigation began with the concrete things I had already found, the name David Carter and the unfamiliar address. I used online search engines, digging deeper than I ever had before. I searched for David Carter in the city-state of the unfamiliar address. It was difficult. Without knowing more, it was just a name. Then I focused on the address. I looked up the address online. It wasn't a house or an apartment building. It was a commercial building that contained, among other things, a mailbox rental service, like a private P.O. box facility, but perhaps more official looking. This explained why mail might go there. But why was his expired license tied to it? Was he living there? Using it as a permanent address? It didn't make sense for someone supposedly living in our house and working at Pinnacle Capital. I went back to the David Carter bank statement. I noted the bank name, Coastline Savings. I searched for that bank. It was a small regional bank, not one of the big national ones. It seemed to operate mostly online, with perhaps a few physical branches, in the state where the unfamiliar address was located. Another piece that didn't fit the narrative of a high-flying financial analyst at a prestigious national firm like Pinnacle Capital. Why would he have a small savings account at a regional bank tied to a mailbox rental address under a different name? The pieces were starting to feel less like random inconsistencies and more like parts of a deliberate, hidden structure. My next step felt terrifyingly cloak and dagger. I needed to access his phone or computer. This felt like the ultimate boundary crossing, but I felt I had no choice. I waited until he was asleep, heart pounding, stomach churning. His phone was always locked, but I had seen him enter his passcode many times. I hesitated, my hand shaking, but I pushed past the guilt. I carefully entered the code and the screen unlocked. My goal was specific. Find anything related to David Carter, the unfamiliar address, the bank Coastline Savings, or any information that would shed light on the financial chaos or the invisible. Family. I knew I had limited time and had to be quick and discreet. His phone wasn't what I expected. It was surprisingly empty? Not full of suspicious messages or apps. He was clearly adept at deleting things or using encrypted apps I didn't recognize. Most of the messages were mundane, texts with me, alerts about news. His call history was often recently cleared. But I found a few things. I found recurring alerts from a specific financial institution I didn't recognize, related to loans or credit lines, always showing past due notifications. These weren't addressed to David Sterling or David Carter, but just a generic account number. More evidence of debt, but the source was still obscured. Red flag number 30, debt from an unknown source. I also found emails in a secondary email, account he had linked on his phone, one I rarely saw him use. These emails weren't from Pinnacle Capital, which I still hadn't found any concrete evidence of beyond his claims, but from various online lenders, payday loan companies, and debt consolidation services. They were chasing him for payments, using firm, sometimes threatening language. And some of these emails were addressed to names slightly different from David Sterling or David Carter, variations, abbreviations, almost like aliases of aliases. The addresses mentioned in some correspondence included not only the unfamiliar address I'd found, but others too. Different cities, different states. Red flag number 31. Multiple aliases and addresses tied to predatory lending. This was far worse than I had imagined. This wasn't just a failed side venture. This was someone deeply, desperately in debt, using multiple names and addresses, involved with shady lenders. This didn't scream senior financial analyst. It screamed someone in serious financial trouble, possibly on the run from creditors. I couldn't find concrete evidence of his family, his job at Pinnacle Capital, or anything definitively linking him to Willow Creek. It was like those parts of his life simply didn't exist in his digital footprint. Or perhaps didn't exist at all. The evidence I found was overwhelmingly centered around debt, secrecy, and multiple identities tied to addresses and banks far removed from the life he claimed to live. My secret investigation, meant to bring clarity, had instead plunged me into a deeper, darker level of confusion and fear. The small lies I had found were just the tip of a massive submerged iceberg of deception. I had proof of multiple aliases, widespread debt, and a complete lack of evidence for the successful, stable life he claimed to have. The man I married wasn't just secretive. He was a ghost, a chameleon, using different names and addresses to evade. Who? Creditors? Law enforcement? I didn't know, but the implications were terrifying. The financial collapse had forced my hand, pushing me to search for answers. And the answers I was starting to find were painting a picture so disturbing, so fundamentally different from the man I thought I knew, that it felt like the ground was dissolving beneath my feet. I was discovering undeniable evidence of deep, systemic deception, piece by painful piece. The web of lies wasn't just about a hidden past or a fake job. It was about a hidden present, a desperate, convoluted existence built on a foundation of financial ruin and multiple fabricated identities. The first major breakthrough, the discovery of David Carter, had opened Pandora's box, and the subsequent discoveries were confirming my deepest fears and showing me the shocking scale of his fabricated life. I had to find out the full truth, no matter how painful, because I knew now that my safety, my financial future, and my very reality depended on it. The next steps in my investigation were going to be even more dangerous, leading me further into the heart of his deception and closer to the devastating truth of who David Sterling really was. That financial collapse wasn't just about the money, it was about control. My control was gone, sucked away by his secrets and his debts. His control, the control he'd maintained over the narrative, over what I knew, over what I thought. I knew that was starting to crumble too, revealing the terrifying emptiness beneath. The panic I felt staring at those overdue bills, seeing my own savings disappear into the abyss of his unknown liabilities, that panic finally pushed me past fear and guilt into action. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't wait for him to tell me the truth because I knew, deep down, he never would. I had to find it myself. My investigation, which had started with that one small envelope, now became a desperate mission. I wasn't just looking for answers. I was looking for solid ground in a life that felt like it was dissolving. I went back, to the beginning, to the few concrete things he'd told me about his life, armed with the knowledge that David Carter existed and that his financial life was a complete mess. I focused on Pinnacle Capital, the prestigious firm he supposedly worked for, the reason he was in Dallas. I had searched for it before, but only casually, mostly looking for his name. This time, I dug deeper. I searched business directories, financial news sites, LinkedIn, everything I could find about Pinnacle Capital. I tried adding Dallas or Denver to the search terms, variations on the name he used. What I found was confusing. There were companies with similar names, small investment firms, but nothing that matched the description he'd given me. A large, established national firm with offices in Denver and Dallas, employing senior financial analysts like him. The addresses I found for the closest matches were generic office buildings, like shared workspaces or virtual offices, not the kind of corporate headquarters he'd vaguely referenced. And absolutely none of them listed a David Sterling in any public capacity, not even as a past employee. Red flag number 32, screaming louder than all the rest combined. the cornerstone of his entire identity, his career, the reason he was in my life, seemed to be completely fabricated. It was a chilling realization. If he didn't work at Pinnacle Capital, where did he work? Was he employed at all? Was the demanding job, the long hours, the travel, the confidential calls, was it all a lie? The possibility was overwhelming. I shifted my focus back to the names and addresses I'd found. David Carter, the unfamiliar address tied to the mailbox rental service. The other variations of his name and addresses I'd seen in the debt emails. I started cross-referencing these names and addresses with public records databases. This felt like the biggest leap into the unknown, entering the murky world of background checks and online searches that felt invasive and scary, but I was desperate. I searched for David Sterling and variations of his name in public records, court records, property records, anything I could access online. And that's when I hit the first truly devastating breakthrough. Searching one of the name variations I'd seen in the emails, combined with an address from the same email correspondence, I found a court filing. It wasn't a criminal case, but a civil one. A judgment against him for a significant amount of money, dating back several years. The plaintiff was a bank. The name on the filing was a variation of David Sterling. Not quite the one he used, but close enough, combined with the address, to be undeniably him. Red flag number 33. Solid proof of long-standing significant debt, predating our relationship, tied to a different name and address. This wasn't just bad investments or a failed side venture. This was a civil judgment, meaning he had been sued and lost, likely for unpaid debt. This wasn't a recent issue. It was years old, meaning the financial problems, the need for money, the hiding. It had been going on long before he ever met me. The story of the successful, financially stable man from Pinnacle Capital crumbled completely in the face of this single court document. But the real shock came when I kept digging. Using the name and address from that court filing, I found more records, more judgments, more civil suits from different banks, different creditors. The names used were variations of David Sterling, David Carter, and other names I hadn't even seen before. The addresses spanned several states. It wasn't just one alias. It was a network of aliases. It wasn't just one debt. It was a mountain of debt, accumulated over years, across multiple jurisdictions, under different names. Red flag number 34. A horrifying constellation of lies and debt, spanning years and multiple identities. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. The man I married, the man who claimed to be a successful financial analyst, was actually someone drowning in debt, using multiple identities, potentially on the run from creditors. The confidential work wasn't about high finance. It was about evading his financial obligations. The travel wasn't for client meetings. Maybe it was to stay one step ahead, to open accounts in new states, to manage this complex web of deception. The private family in Willow Creek? It was the one part of his life I couldn't verify online. The one part of the narrative that remained stubbornly free of the court filings and debt judgments. Could that also be fake? I spent hours, days, glued to my computer, following the breadcrumbs. Each new document, each new name variation, each new address was a punch to the gut. I found records of bounced checks, collection agency filings, liens against property he didn't even own, or claimed not to own, but perhaps did under another name. It was a tangled, horrifying mess, a testament to a life built not just on minor deceptions, but on systemic, long-term fraud and debt evasion. The charming man I fell in love with, the successful professional, the man who wanted a family and a future. That person didn't exist. He was a character, played by a man who was living a completely different, hidden life of financial ruin and deceit. The invisible family wasn't invisible because they were private. They were likely invisible because they didn't exist, or because he was estranged, or because they knew the truth and wanted no part of his fabricated life. The excuses weren't rationalizations for understandable quirks. They were carefully constructed lies designed to keep me in the dark, to prevent me from seeing the reality of his existence. The first major breakthrough wasn't just finding a bank statement or a license. It was finding the undeniable, documented proof that the financial chaos wasn't a temporary issue. It was a long-standing pattern of debt and evasion tied to multiple false or misleading identities. It was the moment I saw the first thread of his true, hidden life, and realized with sickening certainty that the entire tapestry he'd woven for me was a complete and utter fabrication. My husband, David Sterling, didn't just have secrets. His entire life was the secret. And the horrifying scope of that lie was just beginning to reveal itself. Finding those court records, those civil judgments under different names and addresses, it was like someone had ripped the veil away, not just from a small part of his life, but from everything. The first major breakthrough wasn't just one piece of evidence. It was the key that unlocked the horrifying scope of the deception. Once I saw the pattern of debt and aliases in public records, I started connecting the dots with a terrifying clarity. The web of lies wasn't just tangled, it was vast, intricate, and it ensnared every single major aspect of the life he had presented. To me, Pinnacle Capital? Completely unsubstantiated by any public record. The address he sometimes gave, a virtual office, the demanding job, the travel, the long hours, the confidential calls, all likely cover stories for whatever he was actually doing, presumably managing this complex network of debt and deception, potentially engaging in activities that generated cash, however fleetingly, to stay afloat, or perhaps even just trying to evade creditors. Red flag number 35, the total fabrication of his career. The invisible family, the charming stories about Willow Creek, the hardware store, the teacher sister, the park ranger brother, the private parents who were always traveling or unwell. There was absolutely no trace of any of it in the public records I could access, based on the names and addresses I found. No family names associated with him, no property records in Willow Creek under any of his known aliases, no mention of a hardware store linked to his name. Could the people I supposedly met at my wedding have been complicit? Were they friends playing a part? Hired? I didn't even want to think about that level of betrayal, but the possibility hung heavy in the air. Red flag, number 36. The likely fabrication of his entire family and origin story. The aliases weren't just David Carter for an old business project. The debt records listed names like D. Sterling, David M. Sterling, even though I didn't know him to have a middle initial M, David R. Sterling, another initial, and variations on David Carter. Some records even listed subtly different birth dates. It wasn't just one alias. It was a collection of slightly altered identities, used strategically across different states and different financial institutions, making him harder to track. The P.O. boxes, the different addresses I'd seen mail for, the addresses on the old license and bank statement. They weren't just temporary residences. They were likely nodes in this network of aliases and debt evasion. Red flag number 37, a multi-state, multi-alias operation of deceit. The financial chaos wasn't just bad money management or a failed side hustle. It was systemic, long-term debt that he had been accruing and avoiding for years. The emails from payday lenders, the debt consolidation services. It wasn't sophisticated high finance. It was the desperate scramble of someone trapped in a cycle of predatory lending. The big transfers he was always waiting for weren't investment, payouts. Perhaps they were funds from new loans he was constantly trying to secure under yet another name or address. The money I had lent him, the savings I had depleted, wasn't helping him weather a storm. It was propping up this elaborate, collapsing structure of lies. Red flag number 38, living off fabricated income and my savings to sustain the deceit. Every single red flag I had ignored, rationalized, or felt uneasy about now snapped into terrifying focus. The lack of social media? Couldn't. Have a consistent online presence when using multiple identities. The secretive phone calls, likely managing the aliases, the debts, talking to shady lenders or potential new marks. the sparse personal belongings. Hard to accumulate a history of possessions when you might need to disappear or move quickly. The inconsistent stories about Willow Creek. He didn't grow up there. He just picked a picturesque town and invented details. The secretive work. Travel. Likely traveling to set up new addresses, new P.O. boxes, apply for loans in different states under different names, meet with people involved in his schemes. His interest in my finances? Not about helping me, but about understanding. My assets, my liquidity, my potential as a financial resource for his collapsing world. It all fit. Every single piece of the puzzle, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant at the time, now clicked into place, forming a horrifying picture of a life that was 100% fabricated. Not just parts of it. All of it. The successful career, the stable family, the idyllic hometown. It was all a stage setting, a backdrop against which he played the role of the man he wanted me to believe he was. The emotional impact was devastating. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was a profound sense of violation, of having lived a complete and utter lie for years. The man I loved, married, shared my home and my life with, didn't exist. He was a phantom, a character. Every loving glance, every shared dream, every I love you. Was it part of the performance? Was any of it real? The thought was agonizing. It felt like my entire reality had been a carefully constructed illusion, and I had been the unwitting audience, and now, the primary casualty. I felt foolish, gullible. How could I have missed this? How could I have ignored so many red flags? But then I remembered his charm, his sincerity, how perfectly he played the part, how desperately I wanted to believe in the beautiful future he promised. He wasn't just a liar, he was a con artist. A master manipulator who had targeted me, perhaps for my stability, my home, my savings, my willingness to believe. The depth of the betrayal was overwhelming. It wasn't just about the money, though the financial ruin was very real and terrifying. It was about the complete and utter lack of truth at the core of my marriage. I was married to an empty suit, a carefully constructed shell. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't pretend anymore. The evidence I had found wasn't just proof of small lies. It was proof of a completely fabricated existence, a life of debt and deception hidden behind a charming facade. I had pieced together enough of the horrifying truth to know that staying silent, continuing to live with him, was no longer an option. I needed to confront him, not just with the small pieces I'd found before, but with the full horrifying scope of the lies I had uncovered. I had to see what he would do, how he would react, when faced with the undeniable evidence that his elaborate web had been discovered. It wouldn't be easy. He was a master of manipulation. But I was armed with the truth now. The terrifying, heartbreaking truth. And I was ready to force him to face it, no matter how painful that confrontation would be. I had to get answers, not just for myself, but to finally break free from the elaborate prison his lies had built around me. The staged confrontation was the only path forward, the moment where his two worlds, the fake one he lived with me, and the real one I had just uncovered, would finally collide. I spent days gathering the evidence, organizing it. The bank statement for David Carter, the expired driver's license with the unfamiliar address, the printouts of civil judgments under various names and addresses, the emails from predatory lenders, the results of my searches for Pinnacle Capital showing no trace of him, the lack of any credible online footprint for his claimed family or hometown. It was a physical manifestation of the web of lies, a stack of papers detailing the destruction of my reality. I knew I had to approach this differently than the last time. I couldn't let him deflect, gaslight, or turn it back on me. I needed to be calm, firm, and present the evidence in a way that left no room for denial. I decided to wait until he was home and settled, not stressed from a fake work trip. I needed to pick a time when I felt strong, when my resolve hadn't been worn. Down by his daily performance, I chose a Saturday afternoon. He was relaxed, watching TV. I took a deep breath, walked into the living room, and sat down opposite him, the stack of papers on the coffee table between us. My heart was pounding, but adrenaline was also surging. This was it. The moment of truth. "David," I said, my voice steady, maybe a little cold. "We need to talk, seriously, about everything." He looked up from the TV, a casual smile on his face that quickly faded when he saw my expression and the pile of documents. His body. Language shifted immediately. He tensed, his eyes narrowed slightly, the familiar guarded look appearing. "What's this?" he asked, his voice wary. "This," I said, tapping the stack of papers, "is what I've found. It's proof, David. Proof that the life you've told me you live isn't real." I started laying it out, piece by piece. I started with the David Carter bank statement and the expired license. "You told me this was an old professional alias, a confidential project. But it wasn't, was it? David Carter is just one of the names you use." I then slid the printouts of the court judgments across the table. "These are civil judgments, David. Lawsuits for unpaid debt. Under David Carter, yes, but also under D. Sterling. David Monsieur Sterling, other names, tied to addresses in different states. These debts go back years, long before you met me." His face was pale. The practiced composure was cracking, but he still didn't confess. He tried to interrupt, to protest. That's old stuff. Business failures. It's complicated." "Don't," I cut him off, my voice gaining strength. "Don't give me the excuses, David. I'm past that. I searched. I looked for Pinnacle Capital. There's no trace of you working there. The address you sometimes use is a virtual office. Your financial situation isn't complicated or temporarily illiquid. It's a mountain of long-standing debt from predatory lenders detailed in these emails." I pushed the printouts of the emails towards him. "You don't work at Pinnacle Capital, do you?" He was silent, looking away, jaw tight. "And the family?" I continued, the pain finally breaking through my voice. "Willow Creek? The hardware store? Your parents? Your sister? Your brother? Were they real, David? Was any of that real?" He finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something that wasn't performance or manipulation. It was shame, and maybe a flicker of something that looked like sadness. But he still didn't give me a straight answer about his family. He just mumbled, "The job. Things didn't work out. I've been trying to handle things." "Trying to handle things?" I repeated, incredulous. "By creating an entirely fake life, by lying about your name, your job, your family, your past, your finances, everything. By living off my money while you were drowning in debt under multiple aliases?" The questions poured out, years of suppressed doubt and pain finally finding release. "Who are you, David? What is your real name? Where are you really from? What have you been doing all this time?" He slumped back in his chair. The fight seemed to have gone out of him, faced with the undeniable stack of proof. He didn't even try to gaslight me this time. Didn't accuse me of not trusting him. He just looked defeated. I got into some trouble," he started, his voice low, barely audible. "Years ago. Business went bad. Debt piled up. I couldn't get out from under it. I started trying to make it back, trying other things, but it just got worse." His explanation was still vague, still self-serving, focusing on business gone bad rather than outright fraud or intentional debt evasion. He admitted the job at Pinnacle Capital wasn't real. He admitted the debt was worse than he'd said, but he still didn't fully explain the extent of the aliases, the multi-state operation, or the family, the names. I pressed. David Carter? The others? Why so many names? Why so many addresses? To try and start over, he mumbled. To get loans, to keep things going, to keep creditors from finding me. It just spiraled. And Willow Creek? I asked, my voice breaking. Your family? Were they real? Were the people at our wedding? He hesitated, looking away again. My family, they're complicated. It's not what I told you. They're not in the picture. He wouldn't confirm if they were fake, just that they weren't the idyllic picture he painted and weren't involved in his life. It was a partial confession, confirming the family narrative was false, but still shrouded in vagueness. He didn't confess to being a con artist, didn't admit to intentionally targeting me, didn't lay bare the full, horrifying truth of everything he had done and who he really was. But he admitted enough. He admitted the job was fake. He admitted the debt was massive and long-standing. He admitted the different names were about evading creditors. He admitted the family story wasn't true. It was a partial confession, forced out of him by the weight of the evidence, not a genuine moment of repentance. Sitting there, looking at him, hearing his broken, inadequate explanations in the face of the undeniable proof I had assembled, the last vestiges of the man I thought I married dissolved. There was no charm, no confidence, just a defeated, dishonest stranger sitting in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of his lies. The staged confrontation wasn't about getting a full, tearful confession and a complete explanation. It was about forcing the truth into the open, confirming my horrifying discoveries, and making it impossible for him to maintain the facade any longer. It was the moment I officially stepped out of the illusion and into the stark, painful reality. I had married a man who didn't exist, and the man who did exist was a person I didn't know at all, a person whose life was built on debt, aliases, and profound dishonesty. The confrontation was over, but the devastating aftermath of this revelation was just beginning. I had the truth now, or at least enough of it to know that my marriage was over. And the process of untangling my life from this elaborate, destructive web was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done. Sitting there, across from the man I had married, surrounded by the paper evidence of his lies, felt like being in a courtroom where the verdict was already delivered, and it was devastating. He had given his partial confession. The job at Pinnacle Capital? Fake. The mountain of debt? Very real and long-standing, predating me. The different names and addresses? About evading creditors? The family in Willow Creek? Not real, or at least not the picture he'd painted and not involved. But it wasn't a full confession. Not by a long shot. He still made it sound like he was a victim of circumstances, of failed business ventures, of things spiraling out of control. He didn't take full responsibility for the deliberate construction of an entire fake life, for the intentional deceit, for targeting me, for living off my money while he was financially ruined. He didn't explain the full scope of the aliases, where the debt, really, came from beyond vague business failures, or who the people at the wedding were, if his family wasn't in the picture. There were still so many holes, so many unanswered questions swirling in the wake of this partial, forced admission. Looking at him, this man who had shared my bed, my home, my dreams, who had looked me in the eye and lied every single day for years. The love I had felt curdled into a sickening mix of pain, anger, and profound disgust. The person sitting there was a stranger. Not just a stranger because I didn't know his real story, but a stranger because the person I thought he was simply didn't exist. It was like looking at an empty shell, a mask that had finally been removed, revealing nothing I recognized. I remember the room felt heavy, silent, except for my own shaky breathing. The stack of papers on the coffee table was a monument to his deceit. My mind was reeling. trying to process the sheer magnitude of the lie. It wasn't just one big lie. It was thousands of tiny, interconnected lies, told consistently, convincingly, for years. Every conversation about his job, every mention of Willow Creek, every excuse for a financial issue, every reason I couldn't meet his family. It was all a carefully constructed performance, and I had fallen for it. Completely. Hook, line, and sinker. The feeling of being fooled was overwhelming. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed so many signs? The red flags, which I had previously rationalized away, now stood out like giant warning signs I had blithely ignored. His evasiveness about his past, the lack of social, media, the secretive phone habits, the financial instability, the invisible family. They weren't quirks or privacy. They were the consistent behaviors of someone with a massive secret to protect, someone living a double life. Red flag number 39. The gut-wrenching realization of my own naivety, of how effectively I had been manipulated. He kept his gaze down, picking at the edge of a cushion. I'm sorry, he mumbled, his voice flat. But it didn't sound sincere. It sounded like something he felt he had to say. There were no tears, no real signs of remorse for the pain he had caused, only regret at being caught. Sorry? I echoed, the word foreign and inadequate in the face of the destruction he had wrought. You built our entire relationship, our marriage, on a lie. You let me introduce you to my family, my friends. You took my money. You let me plan a wedding based on a fantasy. And you're sorry? My voice was trembling with rage now, but also with sorrow. The future I had planned, the life I thought I was building, was gone, evaporated. Because the partner I had chosen wasn't real. I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. My legs felt weak, but my anger gave me strength. I can't do this, I said, my voice firm despite the tremor. I can't be married to someone who doesn't even have a real life. Who you presented yourself to be isn't who you are. And whoever you actually are. I don't know that person. And based on what I've found, I don't want to know that person. He looked up then, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Wait, he said, standing up too. We can fix this. I can explain everything. I can get help. We can figure this out. Fix what, David? I asked, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. There's nothing to fix. The foundation is rotten. Everything is fake. You lied about everything. How could I ever trust anything you say again? How could I ever believe you? But I love you, he said, stepping towards me, reaching out. That wasn't fake. Everything else. It got out of control. But my feelings for you were real. The classic line. The last defense of the caught deceiver. He was trying to separate the real part of him, the part that supposedly loved me, from the elaborate web of lies. But how could you separate the two? Was the man who had the capacity to construct such a massive, years-long deception, to look me in the eye and lie every day, truly capable of genuine love? Or was even the love part of the performance, a necessary tool to keep me close, compliant, and financially accessible? The thought was sickening. Red flag number 40. The final soul-crushing doubt. Was even the love a lie? I flinched away from his touch. I don't know what's real and what's not anymore, David. Because you've lied. About absolutely everything else. How can I believe that the one true thing was your feelings for me? The pain in my chest was unbearable. I'll leave, he said, seeing the absolute finality in my face. I'll pack a bag. Give you space. Yes, I said, nodding, my voice quiet. Now, drained. You need to leave. This is over. Watching him pack a small bag was surreal. He moved efficiently, mechanically. He didn't pack much, just clothes, toiletries, the essentials. The same way he'd moved into my place years ago, with so little personal history. It reinforced the feeling that he existed without roots, without a tangible past. He avoided my eyes. There was no more pleading, just a grim acceptance of being caught. When he was ready to go, standing by the door, he paused. He looked at me, hesitated. Seemed like he wanted to say something more, perhaps another apology, another plea. But he didn't. He just gave a small, tight nod and walked out the door. And then he was gone. Just like that. The man I married, the man I thought I knew, walked out of my life, leaving behind a mountain of debt, a pile of unanswered questions, and the ruins of the life I thought we had built together. The silence in the house after he left was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of the person who had filled the space, who had been such a central part of my world for years. But it was also the absence of the constant, exhausting need to pretend, to rationalize, to ignore the screaming doubts. The air felt clearer, heavier, and infinitely more terrifying. I was standing alone in my home, no longer married, no longer living a lie, at least not actively participating in his. I was single again, but with the added burden of a shattered reality, significant financial issues he had left behind, and the knowledge that the man I had given years of my life to was a complete fraud. The devastation was profound. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It felt like the end of a chapter of my life that had been entirely fictional. The partial confession had confirmed the core deception, but it was just the first step into the devastating aftermath, into the messy, painful process of separating my life from his lies and figuring out who I was now, standing in the wreckage. The immediate next step was the hardest one, facing the reality of separation and figuring out how to legally untangle myself from a man whose identity was as fluid as his finances. He was gone. Physically, at least. Out of the house. But the aftermath of his departure, the devastating reality of what he had done, permeated every corner of my life. The silence was punctuated by the constant hum of anxiety, about the debts I'd seen, about the ones I hadn't, about my own depleted savings, about the sheer logistical nightmare of divorcing a man who used multiple identities and had no verifiable income or assets. The first few days were a blur of shock and disbelief. I cried. I raged. I sat in stunned silence, staring at the wall. The emotional pain was crippling. It wasn't just grief for the loss of the relationship. It was grief for the loss of the future I had envisioned, for the person I thought I had, loved for the years I had unknowingly invested in a lie. It felt like being hit by a train I never saw coming, even with all the warning signs. But eventually, the survival instinct kicked in. I had to deal with the practicalities. I had to protect myself. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer. This felt like a monumental step, formalizing the end of the marriage, acknowledging that this wasn't just a terrible breakup. It was a legal entanglement with someone who had likely committed financial fraud. Explaining the situation to the lawyer was surreal. So, my husband, I recently found out his job is fake. His family story is fake. He has huge debts under different names, and I'm not entirely sure his legal name is even the one on our marriage certificate. Laying it all out for a professional made the absurdity, the horrifying reality, of it hit home even harder. The lawyer, bless her heart, was initially taken aback, but quickly shifted into professional mode. This wasn't her first rodeo with complicated divorces, but even she admitted this case was unique. The immediate priority was protecting my assets, the house, my remaining savings, my salary, since he had no verifiable income or assets under the David Sterling name that we used legally. and only a mountain of debt under that name and others, the legal process became incredibly complicated. We needed to establish his true identity, understand the full scope of his financial liabilities, and whether any were joint liabilities I was unknowingly responsible for, and navigate the divorce proceedings with someone who had actively concealed his financial reality. Filing for divorce felt like signing a death certificate for the life I thought I had. It was a necessary step, an act of self-preservation, but it was heartbreaking nonetheless. The legal documents required providing his information, his name, address, employment details, and for so many of the fields, the information I had was now suspect or explicitly known to be false. We used the David Sterling name and the last known address, our house, but my lawyer warned me it might be challenging to serve him papers or to get him to cooperate with financial disclosures if he was determined to evade the process, especially if he was using other identities. The financial stress was immense. The overdue bills I had found were just the tip of the iceberg. Without his supposed income, and with my savings gone from covering his, and now, our expenses, I was struggling. I had to talk to my bank, explain the situation, try to untangle my finances from any potential liabilities he might have created that could impact me. It was a humiliating process, having to admit to strangers that I had married a man whose financial life was a complete fiction. Red flag number 41. The public shame and practical nightmare of untangling financial fraud. I also started, slowly, tentatively, telling some of my closest friends and family what had happened. This was incredibly difficult. How do you distill years of charm, love, and then dawning horror and deception into a coherent story? I was afraid they would judge me, blame me, think I was foolish for having fallen for it. But my real friends and family were amazing. They were shocked, yes, heartbroken for me, and incredibly supportive. They listened without judgment, expressed outrage at his actions, and offered practical help, a place to stay if I needed it, help sorting through finances, just being there to listen. Their support was a lifeline in this period of profound isolation and pain. It helped counteract the insidious gaslighting he had subjected me to, the feeling that I was crazy or paranoid. They validated my experience, and that was invaluable. Navigating the legal system while emotionally raw was incredibly difficult. There were forms to fill out, deadlines to meet, conversations with my lawyer that felt detached and clinical while I was drowning in personal pain. My lawyer advised me to try and locate any information I could about his real identity or assets, as his partial confession was likely just another layer of evasion. She suggested hiring a private investigator, if I could afford it. But my finances were precarious. The process of separating didn't bring immediate closure. It brought more questions, more uncertainty. Where was he living? Was he continuing his schemes elsewhere? Would I be on the hook for any of his debts? What was his actual history? His partial confession, while confirming the core deception, had just opened up a Pandora's box of deeper mysteries. This period of separation and filing for divorce was the devastating aftermath I had dreaded. It was the painful, messy process of dismantling a life that was never real. It was dealing with the emotional wreckage of profound betrayal while simultaneously trying to navigate a complex legal and financial situation with a phantom husband. I was grieving the loss of a future, the loss of trust, and the loss of the person I thought was my partner, while fighting to protect myself from the very real consequences of his deceit. It was a low point, a period of immense vulnerability and pain. But as difficult as it was also a necessary step. It was the act of reclaiming my life, of refusing to be defined or destroyed by his lies. And it was during this process, this painful untangling, that I would start to discover just how much darker, how much more shocking, the truth about the man I married really was. The secrets didn't end when he left. They just started bubbling to the surface from the depths of his hidden life. He was gone. The divorce proceedings were inching forward, but the man I had married, or rather, the mystery of who he really was, continued to haunt me. This period, after the separation but before the divorce was finalized, was when even more disturbing truths began to surface. It felt like his departure hadn't closed the chapter on his lies. It had just opened up a new phase of discovery. A phase where the secrets I uncovered were darker and more alarming than just a fake job and some debt. My lawyer was doing her best to navigate the divorce. His cooperation was minimal. He didn't respond promptly to filings, made it difficult to serve him papers. He seemed to be bouncing between temporary addresses, or perhaps using those P.O. boxes. He didn't provide the required financial disclosures. It was clear he was trying to evade the legal process, just as he had evaded creditors for years. This lack of cooperation only solidified my lawyer's and my own suspicion that there was far more to his financial situation and his identity than he had ever admitted. Without his cooperation, getting a full picture was difficult. My lawyer suggested trying to subpoena records from banks or other institutions based on the information I had, but this was expensive and complex, and without a confirmed legal name or social security number for all his aliases, it was like searching for a needle in a haystack across multiple states. However, information started reaching me through other channels. Because the debts were now impacting our address, the house I owned, some creditors who had judgments against David Sterling started sending more aggressive notices, some threatening liens against the property. My lawyer was working to protect the house, arguing that the debts were solely in his name, or his aliases' names, and largely predated the marriage, or were incurred fraudulently. But dealing with these notices was terrifying. It made the abstract concept of his debt feel very real and very threatening to my future. Then, I started getting calls. Strange calls, from numbers I didn't recognize. At first I didn't answer, assuming they were creditors. But one day, stressed and curious, I picked up. It was a woman. She asked for David Sterling. I told her he wasn't here, that we were separated. She paused, then cautiously asked if I was his wife. When I confirmed, she hesitated, then said, "You need to be careful. David Sterling. He's done this before." My blood ran cold. "Done what before?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She explained that she was also a victim of his. Not a romantic partner, but someone he had defrauded in a business deal years ago, using one of his aliases. She had tracked him across states based on the judgments against him, and had seen the divorce filing against a David Sterling at my address in public records. She was calling to warn me, to share information, and perhaps to find others he had hurt. She told me he wasn't just bad with money. He was actively running schemes, business scams that involved taking money from people and businesses and then disappearing, leaving a trail of debt and angry creditors. The aliases and multiple addresses weren't just for evading old debt, they were tools for setting up new cons. Red flag number 42. Learning he was a serial deceiver, potentially a con artist, targeting others. Hearing her story was horrifying. It confirmed my worst fears, that his financial troubles weren't passive failures but active, deliberate fraud, and that I wasn't his only victim. There were others out there, people he had lied to and stolen from. The woman shared some names of his other known aliases and addresses, names that matched some of the more obscure variations I had seen in the debt emails. She also mentioned he sometimes used burner phones and constantly changed details about himself. It painted a picture of someone highly skilled and deeply entrenched in a life of deception. Getting off the phone, I felt sickened, but also a grim sense of validation. I wasn't crazy. He wasn't just flawed, he was dangerous. And the life he led was far more complex and potentially criminal than I had initially understood. This wasn't just about a fake husband. It was about a potential criminal who had entered my life. Armed with the new information from the woman, my lawyer was able to dig a bit further. The names and addresses she provided helped connect more dots in the public records. we found more civil judgments, some related to business disputes, not just personal debt. We even found a record of a restraining order filed against him in a different state years ago, though the details were sealed. Why a restraining order? Was it another victim? Another relationship gone wrong? The possibilities were chilling. Red flag number 43. Hints of past conflicts and potentially volatile behavior. The more information I gathered, the less David Sterling felt like even a partial truth, and more like just one of many disposable identities. The picture emerging was of a man with no fixed address, no stable job, no verifiable family, a history of accumulating vast debt through various means, and a pattern of leaving a trail of financially, and perhaps emotionally, ruined people and businesses behind him. The invisible family felt more and more like a complete fabrication. If he was moving state to state, using aliases involved in fraud, it was highly unlikely he had a stable family in Willow Creek who were just private. They either didn't exist, or he was estranged from them due to his actions. The people at the wedding? The woman I spoke to mentioned he sometimes paid people to pose as references or associates for his schemes. The idea that he had hired actors to play his family at my wedding was a gut punch, a level of calculated cruelty that was almost incomprehensible. Red flag number 44. The chilling possibility that my wedding was a paid performance. This period post-separation was one of constant discovery, each new piece of information more painful and shocking than the last. The man I married was a ghost, yes, but a ghost with a very real history of causing damage. I was learning about the true depth of his deception, the potential criminality of his actions, and the likelihood that I was not the only person who had been fooled and hurt by him. It felt like peeling back layers of an onion, each layer revealing a more pungent, more rotten core. The initial shock of the fake marriage had given way to the terrifying reality of being entangled with someone who might be a serial con artist. Untangling myself legally and financially was crucial, but the emotional toll of discovering the full, dark truth about the man I had loved and trusted felt like it might be permanent. I was learning about his real identity, piece by agonizing piece, and it was far, far worse than I could have ever imagined. And there were still pieces missing, questions unanswered, the full extent of his past and his current activities still shrouded in shadow. He was gone, but the ghost of David Sterling, or whoever he really was, lingered everywhere. The divorce process was slow and painful, made infinitely worse by his continued evasion. He was a moving target, hard to serve, impossible to get financial information from. My lawyer was doing her best, working to protect my assets and untangle me from the financial mess he'd created. The calls from creditors continued, adding another layer of stress and urgency to my life. But it was the information, filtering in little by little, that was the most disturbing. The calls from other people he had defrauded, the hints of a wider pattern of deceit and potential criminality. It wasn't just about our fake marriage anymore. It was about a man who seemed to make a living, or at least survive, by conning others. Based on the snippets of information I'd gathered, the various aliases, the cities mentioned in court documents and emails, the hints from the woman who had called me, my lawyer recommended we hire a private investigator. It was an added expense I could barely afford, especially with my savings depleted and dealing with his residual debts. But I knew it was necessary. I needed to know the full truth, not just for legal purposes, but for my own peace of mind. I needed to understand who this man really was, the man who had invaded my life and shattered it. The private investigator was a professional, detached, and efficient. I gave her everything I had, the name David Sterling, the various aliases I'd found, David Carter, D. Sterling, David M. Sterling, etc., the addresses, the court documents, the emails from lenders, the name of the woman who had contacted me. It felt strange handing over the pieces of my destroyed life to a stranger, but she approached it methodically, like a puzzle to be solved. Her findings came back in phases over the next few months, each report peeling back another layer of the onion, revealing a truth that was both horrifying and sickeningly predictable. First, she confirmed what I already suspected. There was no record of a David Sterling ever working for a company called Pinnacle Capital in Denver or Dallas. The addresses I'd linked to Pinnacle Capital were indeed virtual offices or co-working spaces, places where someone could rent a mailbox or a desk for appearances, but not legitimate corporate headquarters where a senior financial analyst would be employed full-time for years. His entire career story was a complete fabrication. Red flag number 45. Final confirmation of the elaborate career lie. Next, she delved into the aliases. David Sterling was, in fact, his legal name on his birth certificate and social security card, but he had a history of using variations of it. And the David Carter name I'd discovered wasn't just an old business alias. It was another identity he had actively used, complete with bank accounts, credit lines, and utility bills associated with various addresses across several states over the past decade. The investigator found evidence of him using at least 3 or 4 other significant name variations, tied to bank accounts, loan applications, and business registrations, for apparently fake businesses, in different states. States he had claimed to be traveling for work in during our relationship. Red flag number 46. Confirmation of a deliberate, long-term pattern of using multiple identities for fraudulent purposes. The addresses were key. The investigator mapped out a complex web of addresses associated with his different aliases. P.O. boxes, mailbox rental services, short-term apartment rentals, even seemingly random residential addresses that might have belonged to other people he had scammed or briefly stayed with. There was no single, stable address for him over the past 10 years, just a constant rotation, a pattern of movement consistent with someone trying to evade detection. Red flag number 47, confirming a transient lifestyle built on avoidance. And the financial situation? It was far worse and far more entrenched than I could have imagined. The court judgments I'd found were just a fraction of the picture. The investigator uncovered records of bankruptcies filed and dismissed under different names in different states, more civil suits from banks and individuals, liens, wage garnishment orders, though there were no wages to garnish, and a long history of defaults on various types of loans, business loans, personal loans, even car loans. It wasn't just consumer debt. It was debt accrued through a series of failed or fraudulent business ventures. The pattern was clear. Start a business, often just on paper. Take out loans, acquire funds from investors or clients, and then default or disappear, leaving others holding the bag, and then move on to the next state, the next alias, the next scheme. Red flag number 48. The horrifying reality of a decade-long pattern of financial fraud and evasion. The depth of his financial ruin and the lengths he had gone to hide it were staggering. He didn't just have bad luck. He had built a life on taking money he wasn't entitled to and then actively evading the consequences. The Pinnacle Capital facade wasn't just a lie about his job. It was a sophisticated cover story designed to attract a certain kind of person, stable, employed, likely with assets, and make them feel secure in his supposed success, making them easier to manipulate, perhaps financially or otherwise. And the family? This was perhaps the most personally devastating revelation. The private investigator found limited information about his actual family. He did have parents and siblings, but they didn't live in Willow Creek, Colorado. They lived in a completely different state, on the other side of the country from where he claimed to be from. There was no family-owned hardware store. His sister was not a teacher. His brother was not a park ranger. There was no indication of a close-knit, idyllic, small-town family life. Red flag number 49, the utter fabrication of his family and origins. The most painful part. The investigator found records suggesting a significant estrangement between him and his actual family. Whether this estrangement was a result of his fraudulent activities or predated them, I don't know. But there was no indication they were involved in his current life, or that they had any knowledge of his actions, or that they were complicit in the wedding charade. It seemed his actual family was as much in the dark about his double life as I had been. Or perhaps they knew just enough to want nothing to do with him. The possibility that the people at my wedding were indeed paid actors, or maybe very distant, uninvolved relatives he somehow coerced, was almost too much to bear. It meant the entire wedding, the merging of families, was a complete performance staged for my benefit, uncovering the full, verified truth about who he was. A serial deceiver living a life of aliases, debt evasion, and potential fraud with a completely fabricated past was a painful, traumatic process. It wasn't just finding out he had lied. It was seeing the systematic, long-term nature of his deception and the sheer emptiness at the core of the person I had married. The man I loved, the man I had grieved, never actually existed. He was a role, played by a con artist. Knowing the real identity, the one buried beneath the aliases and lies, didn't bring closure immediately. It brought a deeper level of shock, hurt, and the daunting realization of the immense task ahead. Not just legally divorcing him, but rebuilding my entire life from the ground up. A life that had been thoroughly disrupted and nearly destroyed by his intricate web of lies. The scale of it all was overwhelming, and the process of picking up the pieces felt monumental. Learning his real history, seeing the documented proof of his decade-long pattern of aliases, debt, and deception, it was like staring into an abyss. The man I married was, at his core, empty. A shell. He didn't have a stable past, a real job, or a genuine family life to share. He had a history of taking, of deceiving, of leaving a trail of destruction, and now I was part of that trail. Picking up the pieces felt like trying to rebuild a house that had been flattened by a tornado. Where do you even start? The immediate aftermath of uncovering his true identity and the scope of his lies was dominated by dealing with the practical and emotional fallout. Financially, it was a nightmare. My savings were gone, eaten away by covering expenses he should have been paying, and likely some that went directly toward his debts or schemes. The stress of the calls from creditors was immense. My lawyer was invaluable here, working to protect my assets and demonstrate that his debts were separate and often predated the marriage. But it was a slow, costly process. I had to go through every single bill, every bank statement, every joint account. Thankfully, we didn't have many fully joint accounts, another red flag I'd semi-consciously avoided. Trying to understand what was mine, what was his, and what potential liabilities I might still face. It felt like sifting through the debris of a bomb site. Red flag number 50. The sheer scale of the financial destruction I was left to navigate. I had to tighten my belt dramatically. No more dinners out, no more vacations, cutting back on everything. I picked up extra freelance work, anything to try and start rebuilding my finances and covering the legal fees to get divorced. It was humbling and exhausting, having to work twice as hard just to get back to where I was before I met him. Emotionally, the ruin was profound. The betrayal cut deeper than I can describe. It wasn't just about the money or the fake life. It was about the fact that the person I had been most vulnerable with, the person I had loved and trusted completely, was a complete fabrication. It made me question my own judgment, my ability to read people, everything I thought I knew about, relationships and love. I felt like I had lived in a Truman Show-like reality for years, where everyone else was in on the secret, and I was the only one who didn't know the cameras were rolling and the script was fake. The shame was immense. Having to tell people, even my closest friends and family, about the full extent of the lie was incredibly difficult. Explaining that the charming, successful man they liked was actually a serial deceiver felt surreal. Their support helped, but the internal feeling of failure, of having been so profoundly fooled, was hard to shake. I withdrew a bit, finding it hard to trust people, hard to believe anything anyone said. My ability to connect authentically with others felt damaged. The divorce process itself dragged on. He continued to be elusive, uncooperative. Locating him reliably was difficult. My lawyer suspected he was trying to delay things, maybe hoping I would give up, or maybe just continuing his pattern of evading any form of legal or financial accountability. It felt like a constant battle, even though he wasn't physically present. The legal system, while necessary, felt slow and frustrating when dealing with someone who operated outside the bounds of normal legal processes. The fact that his identity was fluid, tied to multiple addresses and aliases, made everything exponentially more complicated. My lawyer had to use all the information the private investigator found to try and connect the dots legally, demonstrating that David Sterling, David Carter, and the other names were all the same person. My home, the place that was supposed to be our shared sanctuary, felt tainted. It was filled with memories of a person who didn't exist, of conversations that were built on lies, of a life that was a performance. I constantly saw reminders of him, a book he'd left behind, a piece of furniture he'd helped pick out, the very walls that had contained years of his deception. I felt a desperate urge to cleanse the space, to remove every trace of his presence, but that felt overwhelming and impractical. There were days where the weight of it all felt unbearable. The financial stress, the emotional pain, the complexity of the legal situation, the feeling of isolation and broken trust. It was tempting to just want to hide away from the world, but deep down, I knew I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let his lies destroy me completely. I had to keep going, not just to untangle the legal and financial mess, but to reclaim my own life, my own identity, which had become so intertwined with his elaborate fiction. This period of picking up the pieces was brutal. It was the raw, painful reality of dealing with the wreckage. There was no immediate healing, just the hard, exhausting work of sorting through the debris, assessing the damage, and figuring out how to start rebuilding. It was a constant reminder of the betrayal, the lies, the years lost. But it was also the beginning of the process of finding my own strength again. I was forced to become resilient, to learn about legal processes I never thought I'd need, to handle financial stress I'd never experienced, to rely on my own judgment again, despite having been so profoundly fooled. The ruins were vast, but within them, slowly, painfully, I was starting to find the first fragile signs of my own resilience and the possibility of eventually healing and rebuilding a life that was truly my own, built on honesty and truth. Picking up the pieces was a long, arduous process, marked by setbacks and moments of despair. The divorce took time, complicated by his lack of cooperation. Dealing with the creditors, fighting to protect my home and my finances from debts that weren't truly mine, was an ongoing battle. There were days I felt completely overwhelmed, buried under the weight of it all, but slowly, painstakingly, things started to shift. The process of healing and rebuilding wasn't linear, but there were definite steps forward, small victories that gave me hope. First, the legal process, while slow, did move forward. Eventually, with the evidence my lawyer and the private investigator had gathered about his multiple aliases and pattern of evasion, the court was able to make decisions regarding the divorce. He was held responsible for the debts incurred under his various names and addresses. My home and my assets were protected from his creditors, thanks to the clear demonstration that his financial issues largely predated the marriage and were the result of his own fraudulent activities, not joint marital debt. This was a massive relief, lifting a huge financial burden and allowing me to finally start focusing on rebuilding my own financial stability. Getting that divorce decree felt like cutting the last legal cord binding me to him and his lies. It was formal, final, and freeing. Financially, the road back was long. I worked hard, saved diligently, and was incredibly cautious with money. The experience had fundamentally changed my relationship with finances. I was more aware, more protective, and maybe a little more wary. But with the legal issues resolved and his debts no longer a direct threat, I could focus on my own future, on slowly rebuilding the savings he had depleted. It wasn't quick, but it was progress. Emotionally, the healing was even more complex. The betrayal left deep scars. The feeling of being fooled didn't vanish overnight. Trusting people, especially in romantic relationships, became incredibly difficult. Every new person I met, every date I went on, when I eventually felt ready to even consider dating again, was viewed through a lens of suspicion. I was hyper-aware of inconsistencies, of things that didn't quite add up. It took conscious effort and time to learn to distinguish between genuine red flags and my own trauma-induced hypervigilance. Therapy was incredibly helpful during this period. Talking through the trauma, the betrayal, the impact on my sense of self and my ability to trust with a professional was crucial. It helped me process the anger and pain, understand the dynamics of manipulation, and start rebuilding my self-worth, which had been so damaged by his deceit. Connecting with my friends and family continued to be a source of strength. Having people who loved me and believed me, who saw the real me and weren't fooled by his facade, was invaluable. They were patient with my process, understanding when I struggled, and celebrated the small steps forward with me. Rebuilding. Trust in relationships started with reinforcing the trust I had in the people who had proven themselves to be truly there for me. One significant part of healing was reclaiming my narrative. For years, I had been living within a story he had created. Now I was the one telling my story, sharing it with trusted people, and eventually deciding to share it more publicly, though in a way that protected my privacy, was incredibly empowering. It turned me from a passive victim into someone who had survived, uncovered the truth, and was willing to share her experience to maybe help others. It was a way of taking control back, of refusing to let his lies be the end of my story. Slowly, tentatively, I started to build a new life. It wasn't the life I had planned with David Sterling, but it was a life built on a foundation of truth, resilience, and my own strength. I focused on my career, my friendships, my hobbies. I found joy in simple things again, things that had been overshadowed by the constant stress and secrecy of the marriage. I learned to trust my own intuition. Again, that gut feeling I had suppressed for so long. This time, I vowed, I would listen. There are still moments, even now, years later, where the memory of it all washes over me. The shock, the betrayal, the sheer absurdity of having married a ghost. The scars are there, a reminder of what I survived. But they are no longer open wounds. They are part of my story, part of what made me stronger, more resilient, more aware. I don't know where he is or what he's doing. He disappeared back into the ether he seemed to come from. I sometimes wonder if he's still living the same life of aliases and deception, leaving a trail of wreckage behind him. A part of me hopes he is held accountable for his actions, for the damage he caused. But my focus isn't on him anymore. My focus is on my own life, the one I am actively building, brick by honest brick. Healing isn't about forgetting, it's about integrating. It's about acknowledging the pain and the loss, but not letting it define you. It's about recognizing the lessons learned, about trust, about red flags, about the importance of knowing who you are sharing your life with, and the even greater importance of knowing and trusting yourself. I am wiser now, more cautious, yes, but also more resilient and more determined to live a life filled with authenticity and genuine connection. The process of rebuilding continues, but I am standing on solid ground now, finally free from the elaborate web of lies that nearly consumed me. I survived, and I am moving forward, forever changed, but stronger, and ready to build a future that is truly, authentically mine. And so, the telling comes to its close, doesn't it? The long path we walked together tonight, winding through all those moments, all those carefully constructed layers. It finally leads here, to this quiet space at the end of it all. Sitting here now, with the silence around me feeling so different than the silence that held the secrets for so long. It's strange. It's like finally setting down a weight you didn't even realize had become part of your own shape. And for a moment, you just sway a little, getting used to the lighter air. The truth, when it finally shows its face, isn't always a roaring thunderclap. Sometimes it's just the quiet click of pieces falling into place, illuminating the dusty corners you tried not to look at for so long. It was painful, yes, uncovering the foundations built on sand, but there's a strange, stark beauty in seeing things for what they truly are, messy and imperfect as that reality might be. There's a clarity that settles in, like still water after a storm, reflecting a sky that might be bruised, but is finally clear. Perhaps the only gentle whisper I can offer now, after everything, is this. Listen. Listen closely to that quiet hum inside you. The one that sometimes gets drowned out by the noise and the hopes and the stories others tell. Trust it, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it whispers doubts about something shiny and beautiful that you desperately want to. Be real. The truth has a way of finding you, eventually. But sometimes, the kindest thing is to find it yourself, softly, before the world makes you. Our story ends here tonight, not with a bang, but with the quiet exhale of a long-held breath, leaving behind just the soft echoes of the journey. It's okay now. You can let go of it all. Let the words fade like distant dreams and just rest. Thank you for listening all the way through. I wish you tranquil thoughts and the sweetest of dreams.